In 1987, the SCP Foundation became aware of a series of unusual events occurring in Sverdlovsk's port on the White Sea. While looking into these events, Foundation satellites detected a mass of unknown material in the port's dry docks. Over the course of 6 days, the mass grew larger and larger until it formed into a fully functioning submarine, which promptly left the port. Foundation vessels in the area attempted to intercept the craft, but it had already dove too deep to reach. It would not be seen again until 1995, when it was spotted off the coast of Madagascar. This time, the Foundation was able to attach a GPS to the top of the hull. 3 months later, containment procedures were adopted, and the submarine was classified SCP-2956. SCP-2956 is a Project 941 Akula-class Soviet submarine that is traversing the oceans of the world in a pattern that appears to be semi-random. SCP-2956 is able to dive to depths unusual for its class of submarine, and is also able to dive at an exceptionally fast rate. SCP-2956 spends the majority of its time traveling the world at a depth of around 1,200 to 1,500 meters below the surface. Though the route varies, the submarine usually passes through the Bering Strait at least once on its journey. Because SCP-2956 is a Project 941 submarine, it is presumed to have an arsenal of torpedoes on board. However, it has never attempted to attack civilian or Foundation vessels, as far as anyone can tell. Each surfacing event is believed to be the submarine's attempt to investigate vessels in the surrounding area. Between these surfacing events, SCP-2956 stays in hibernation for 3 to 4 months at a time, during which it rests at the bottom of deep-sea trenches, such as the Marianas Trench. The mechanisms of SCP-2956 remain a mystery, as well as its apparent ability to regenerate by shedding its hull, replacing it with a new spotless hull whenever the old one wears out. Whatever method it accomplishes this by, the regeneration allows it to repair any damage done by Foundation anti-submarine weapons. At least 12 of these shed coverings have been found on the seabed in the craft's usual hibernation spots. In addition to its anomalous physical properties, the submarine has been observed broadcasting repeating tones and Soviet marching songs via a transponder system in the vessel. On a few rare occasions, the craft has attempted to communicate through this system, but whatever it has attempted to say has been difficult to understand. The submarine was originally thought to be autonomous, but the Foundation later discovered that the submarine is controlled by an entity referred to as SCP-2956-1. While speaking through its transponder, the entity claimed to be Ivan Redacted, a Soviet military officer who died in a fuel explosion in Almaty, Kazakhstan in the 1980s, according to Soviet documents. While looking into this claimed identity, the Foundation was approached by SCP-2956-2, a middle-aged Caucasian man named Peter Redacted. Well, maybe approached is the wrong word. Peter drove his car through the gate outside of a Foundation site with the express intent of being captured. After he introduced himself. Peter defected from the Russian government in 1991 and became a US citizen. He had prior knowledge of the Foundation due to his time in the Russian government. The Foundation performed a hip cortex neurological analysis on Peter and found that he shared a Class 4 telepathic connection with SCP-2956-1. What's more, Peter claimed that the entity in the submarine was his biological brother, Ivan. Through this psychic connection, Peter was able to receive messages from Ivan, as well as hallucinations and images. Whenever Peter was asleep, SCP-2956 would become more active, implying that its activity levels are directly tied to the psychic connection. Dr. Froon of Site-77 was able to sit down with SCP-2956-2 for an interview after he was given a room at the site. His stay there was technically optional, but highly encouraged. She introduced herself and asked him to tell her more about his brother, Ivan. Well, I guess I'll start off by saying he was my younger brother. We only had each other to begin with. Our mother was always out, busy. His life took a somewhat different turn. He rose up in the military after I had enlisted him, because he was too shy to do it himself. He really made our mother proud, and every other comrade, really. I didn't hear much from him until the event. This piqued Dr. Froon's interest, and she prodded more for information on this so-called event. He died, to put it simply.
Died in the fuel explosion somewhere. They showed us his body burnt and unrecognizable. They took it away, cut it up, repurposed parts of his body in the lab somewhere. Then they took his consciousness, removed it from his brain, and placed it inside a computer. He told me how his world was 2D, completely incomprehensible to the mind. He was noticeably different after that. It was quite obvious how removing his mind from his body had messed with him.
After this, Peter explained they must have put Ivan's consciousness into the submarine somehow. He elaborated.
They put me through some treatment, which is how I was able to communicate with him. I was unconscious for most of it, so I don't really know what happened. They just released me after a couple weeks, and I got back to my government job, and I've been able to communicate with him ever since.
However, Peter went on to explain he rarely communicated with Ivan. If he did, Ivan would open the floodgates and bombard him with hallucinations and images. Ivan, he said, would often describe being in a great deal of pain, and would discuss his belief that if he completed his mission, the GRU would somehow turn him back into a man. What was that mission? Dr. Froon found the answer during an analysis of the submarine. Ivan was tasked with launching nuclear warheads after the USSR fell, but Peter was able to keep him in check.
I act as a mental firewall, stopping him from launching nukes and attacking vessels. My job was to give him control when the time was right, all the way up to Glasnost, although they were banking on me not defecting in '91. I know that if I gave him the keys, he'd do it, no doubt. He sees it as his only option, really.
This was the reason for the mental bombardment, the hallucinations, the troubling images, the pleas for help. Ivan was trying to get Peter to give in and let him take full control. They concluded the interview with a promise from Dr. Froon that they would speak again soon. When they did, Peter was doing much worse than before. Ivan was hitting him harder than ever. He suggested that he be given less time to sleep, but Dr. Froon rejected this proposal. He was already sleep-deprived enough, but Peter would not be swayed. He told Dr. Froon,
I think Ivan is planning something. He keeps trying to grab the controls whilst I'm asleep. I've become quite adapted to waking up in time, but it's starting to get mentally taxing. It's getting harder to concentrate. Why are you here?
She was there to learn more about what Ivan had been sending. According to Peter, Ivan was beaming footage directly into his brain. There were Russian marching songs, Karl Marx quotes, and a 3-hour documentary about the Russian Revolution. At this point in the interview, Peter began to sweat and stare at the corner of the room. He was suddenly overtaken by a vivid hallucination.
I think it's meant to be Ivan. When he was young, it's quite fuzzy all around the edges. He's throwing a ball against the wall of the room. I think it's his favorite ball when he was 10. When he does something like that, it gets hard to hate him. It reminds me of better times, Doctor. Ivan did this yesterday whilst I was trying to sleep. Some faceless commissar appeared by the side of my bed and started lecturing me about communism and society and everything, then went on a tangent about the woods near our old house. I want you to understand how hard it is to concentrate on anything whilst a man is screaming in my face, asking if I'm hiding the Tsar under my floorboards. This room doesn't even have floorboards.
Dr. Froon expressed concern regarding Peter's mental and physical state. She also reported issues with SCP-2956, which were becoming more and more frequent. While Peter was asleep, the submarine attempted to ram one of the Foundation's vessels, which were attempting to monitor it. Dr. Froon proposed a solution. Peter could try to speak with Ivan and lure him to the surface. Somewhere he could be trapped. Peter bristled at the suggestion.
Ivan doesn't deserve to be treated like an object. He does not deserve to get locked up in a pen and tested on. You lied to him, just like the GRU lied to him about bringing him back and fixing him. I'm not able to anyway. He has severed my line of communication. I cannot speak with him.
After a bit of back and forth, Peter asked Dr. Froon to make him a promise.
When you do attempt to destroy the submarine, which I know you will try, make sure you kill Ivan as well. Do not leave anything behind. Completely destroy it and leave nothing behind. I don't want him to be conscious down there. Even if the first thing he tries to kill with a missile is me, he is my brother, and in a way, I want what's best for him.
At this point in the conversation, the hallucination of little Ivan returned. Peter became overwhelmed with grief and asked for time in a reduction chamber to give him some peace of mind. 2 days after this interview, Peter collapsed in his cell from a sudden seizure, which triggered cardiac arrest. At this exact moment, a missile was launched from SCP-2956, breaking the surface of the water and targeting the SCP vessels by surprise. The missile was on its way to its target, the city of Paris, when Peter was revived by medical staff. The missile's propulsion system spontaneously failed, and the missile lost momentum, falling into the Bay of Biscay without detonating. Dr. Froon met with the recovering Peter, who explained that Ivan had been hitting him even harder, bombarding him with new images, including a troubling image of Ivan in a field. In this field scene, Ivan was standing at the bottom of a pile of wood, surrounded by 6 people strung up on crosses. Once, the people were the Romanovs. Another time, it was businessmen. Then, it was Peter himself. Just before his seizure, Peter had been watching the television in his cell, when the footage changed to depict VHS footage of him and Ivan as children, playing in the garden before their mother called out to them. Next, the footage cut to him and Ivan walking down the road towards school. Ivan turned to look at the camera, as if he knew they were being filmed. Next, the classroom, Ivan and Peter being filmed there by the strange men with the camera. Then Ivan began to chant over and over, until a submarine crashed through the wall, crushing and killing everyone in the classroom. The camera turned to show a man, a mouth full of worms. He was laughing. Even after Peter broke the television, the images would not leave him alone. Ivan seized control, and then he woke up. Peter described other horrific visions: submarines, an empty pedestal, an empty crib. He remembered a gynecologist's room next to the operating theater where he was worked on. Then he asked Dr. Froon if she was pregnant. She was, but he should have no way of knowing that. Shortly after, Peter was physically attacked by his hallucinations. 60 humanoids invaded his containment chamber and attacked him, bludgeoning him with instruments and strangling him with violin strings. Shortly after, a series of sentences written in Cyrillic appeared on the eastern wall. They translated to, "If you're locked up and I'm a submarine, we'll always have each other. Don't trust them. I didn't mean to hurt you." Peter broke down crying and refused to speak anymore. At this point, the Foundation designated SCP-2956 a level red threat to humanity. There could be no more waiting around. They had to find a way to neutralize it. When SCP-2956 dove down towards the bottom of the Java Trench, the SCPF faithful attempted to establish contact. The voice that was heard was not Ivan's, but rather that of one of the men who did this to him.
The psychologists have done a lot of work to mentally prep all candidates in our project. You should be able to imagine a room with all your friends adorned with nice paintings and our eternal leader sitting proudly at the center. Your brother will be there as well at some point. You will not be alone throughout all this, Ivan. We have been kind enough to allow you to have some semblance of company, even if it's only psychological. We are not monsters. You always wanted kids, right? That's what everyone wanted. Well, soon you'll be kept occupied by a lovely bundle of joy. But we're still working on that. Obviously, no one is going to give up their own kid for the project.
During this communication, Foundation operatives placed a nuclear warhead along with a bath escape, which would allow them to destroy SCP-2956. After the recording being broadcast by the submarine finished looping for a 4th time, a D-class was ordered to detonate the bomb. The bath escape was destroyed along with SCP-2956. It hit the seafloor, and it was still. At the exact same moment, Peter crossed himself, wished Ivan goodbye, and suddenly died. A bust of Lenin manifested where his corpse fell, and then vanished along with the 3 containment specialists in the room. Personnel in the vicinity experienced retinal detachment, decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis, and even death. Dr. Froon experienced abdominal pain, and would later learn that her unborn child had vanished. SCP-2956 was considered neutralized and reclassified safe. Sometime later, a man was found dead in a Tehran apartment rigged with IEDs and a speaker system playing an Arabic remix of Yellow Submarine by the Beatles. There was a handwritten note left on the scene, written in Russian Cyrillic. It read, Forgive me, for I have sinned. We went against God's will and took a man from his natural shell. We removed charred bones, skin, flesh, everything, and mixed it with cold steel and depth gauges, grew it up in a petri dish, built it up to the real thing. We kept his soul, removed its chance of a place in heaven, and let a machine consume it. The machine churned up his mind, minced and reduced to the point of being completely unrecognizable and childlike. We should have stopped with the peat grinder, the Lada, the Tupolev, the hydroelectric dam, the helicopter, the oil refinery. We put broken men's minds inside of useless, unintelligible. One man was an honest cancer patient. Once he had a wife, took his children to school, sung the anthem. Now he sits there, out on the steppe, letting water in and out to power a city full of drunken Kazakhs. And you know what? Someday he'll let less water in, just to make a point, to piss someone off. Who? Some unknown entity, some ambiguous figure of authority which governs the Kremlin from the shadows. All he can do is stand and stomp his childish feet in that dingy room with Lenin and that baby, both him and Ivan, next to their little paintings. Ivan's still alive, and it pains me. I'm getting his transmissions on my receiver. I know you soulless monsters will find my dead body. So I just want you to know that you failed. You failed. The mind of a child trapped in a metal tomb, sitting at the bottom of the darkest hole on Earth, wanting nothing more than to see his brother and feel life. And the worst bit, he still thinks he needs to finish his job and end the world. End the world he doesn't even know how a nuke works, how they remove cities, burn people alive, gut the atmosphere with radiation, leaving behind nothing but faded shadows against scorched concrete. He's just a child doing what he's been told. This is my goodbye to everyone, and my wish for forgiveness. Ivan's struggle touched me, and this is my statement against the mess we call the GRU division. I am sorry, Anna. I'm sorry, Yuri. I am sorry, David. Cast your mind back to the height of the Cold War. The ever-accelerating nuclear arms race brought us closer than ever before to making the nightmare of nuclear Armageddon a terrifying reality. The two main parties in this conflict are the United States and Soviet Union, each amassing huge amounts of nuclear warheads and jumping on any available advantage they can over their enemies. What you may not know is that in order to detect an impending attack from the United States, the Soviets developed what would become known to the West as the Dead Hand. But this experimental piece of technology also had another name, SCP-1984. It is no secret that the Soviet Union feared the threat of US nuclear strikes and invasion just as much as the US feared an attack from them. So SCP-1984 was created to act as a deterrent mechanism, specifically against secure second strikes. Secure second strikes were both a deterrent and overwhelming concern during the Cold War, referring to a country's ability after suffering an initial nuclear attack to still retaliate, firing on their enemy and causing untold damage with their own arsenal of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union knew that any action they made that could be perceived as an attack on United States soil would be threatened with nuclear retaliation, and that if they fired first, America would return fire and potentially annihilate them with a second strike. SCP-1984 was to be an automated system that would activate in response to the destruction of the Soviets' main command and control structure. Given that the Dead Hand was created during the 80s, you might be forgiven for expecting a nuclear detection system built at this point in history to consist of various sensors connected to a computer network. But you have also probably already realized that if this was the case, then the Foundation wouldn't be so interested in it. In actuality, SCP-1984 is a fully autonomous entity rather than a network of sensors for detecting incoming nuclear strikes, or a computer capable of initiating a second strike. Perhaps what makes the Foundation more interested in the Dead Hand is that it is both self-aware and links simultaneously to every single one of Russia's nuclear launch sites. Not only this, but SCP-1984 also has direct access to every single one of the atomic weapons stockpiled by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and is capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at a moment's notice. In short, SCP-1984 could very easily and horrifyingly quickly trigger an all-out nuclear war, resulting in the extinction of all life on Earth. No wonder the Foundation considers the Dead Hand such a massive threat. SCP-1984 itself actually consists of the preserved remains of a Russian soldier by the name of Sergeant Marat Chernikov, who was killed during the Soviet-Afghan War in 1982. Most of the official documentation of Chernikov's existence has been expunged by the Russian Federation, and he is only referred to in fragmented documents recovered by the Foundation that refer to a Project December. These remains serve as the location of a semi-sentient consciousness that has been classified as SCP-1984-01. When it remains dormant and is not interfered with, SCP-1984-01 has the ability to receive and process any signal broadcast to it, and is able to decipher information combined in any signal it picks up. However, when global military tensions start to climb, especially when those tensions affect the Russian Federation, or what were once the satellite states of the former Soviet Union, the entity begins to manifest itself in the physical world, and usually in various strange and different ways. SCP-1984-01 has been known to appear in the real world in forms such as a humanoid outline, or a bright red specter taking the shape of a child with its legs cut off. Regardless of which shape it appears in, it is when the Dead Hand manifests in a more physical form that the wider scope of its abilities become clear. As mentioned previously, it can influence and even launch nuclear weapons, overriding their command systems and bypassing launch sequences. After appearing fully, SCP-1984-01 will travel at speeds of up to 140 kilometers an hour, directly to the nearest military installation capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles. Once it reaches its destination, SCP-1984-01 will immediately attempt to override the necessary systems to initiate a launch. After firing missiles at their predetermined targets, SCP-1984-01 will hastily travel to another facility housing nuclear ordnance, repeating the process until it has successfully launched all of Russia's atomic weapons. When engaged, the physical manifestation of SCP-1984 is highly aggressive, and will lethally defend itself against anyone that it observes trying to interfere with it or stop it from causing a nuclear launch. The entity has displayed the ability to disrupt the nervous system, causing excruciating pain and debilitating damage to human beings. Its only known weakness, if any, is a susceptibility to microwave radiation. Although exposure to this does not seem to cause any lasting damage to SCP-1984, instead only temporarily disorienting its physical form. As for the origins of SCP-1984, the Soviet Union's official liaison with the SCP Foundation offered some clarity on this. Ironically, during early 1984, the liaison, a doctor named Sergei, described information regarding the Dead Hand as being of grave importance to the continued survival of the human race. Seeing as he was referring to an enemy that could single-handedly launch the Soviet Union's entire nuclear arsenal, he certainly had a point. A top-secret conference was held in Sarajevo between the Foundation's O5 Council and officials from both the USSR and the United States, using the 1984 Winter Olympics as cover, avoiding too many questions about several nations' high-ranking state officials being in the same place at once. The O5 Council was then given full, in-depth information about the Dead Hand, something they had previously assumed was a more conventional form of nuclear deterrence. SCP-1984 was far more, and worse, far out of the control of the Russian government. It was revealed that the entity had been designated outside the original specifications given to those who developed it. Initially, the Soviets had intended for the Dead Hand to be solely used as a secure second strike response. If the leaders of the Soviet Union were killed, SCP-1984 would react in kind to Russia's enemies, launching back all of the USSR's nuclear missiles in retaliation. This is more likely where the Dead Hand nickname comes from, hearkening to the idea of a dead man's switch. Picture that you had been mortally wounded by your worst enemy, shot in the stomach and laying on the ground, rapidly bleeding out. You know that there is no chance you will survive, but you cannot afford to let your enemy get away. What they don't know is that you rigged the entire building around you both with explosives. With your dying breath, you activate the detonator, assuring your own and your enemy's mutual destruction. Kaboom. Then curtains for both of you. The pressing issue, and the reason this secret summit between the USSR, USA, and SCP Foundation was held, was that SCP-1984 was no longer interested in just waiting for Russia to be attacked and only reacting after the fact. Instead, the entity's physical form was trying to preemptively strike at the enemies of the motherland, attempting to activate nuclear launches and send atomic weapons to destroy the United States, France, West Germany, and the People's Republic of China. In other words, the Dead Hand was eager to get a head start at causing total nuclear annihilation, not to mention potentially killing millions and reducing target countries to little more than irradiated craters, awash with deadly nuclear fallout. Both the Soviet Union and the United States begged the SCP Foundation to intervene and contain SCP-1984, and under the direction of the O5 Council, they stepped in to take direct control of the situation, establishing new containment procedures in the hopes of keeping SCP-1984 from hitting as many launch buttons as it could find. The embalmed remains that seemed to create the manifestations of the Dead Hand entity were held securely in an armed containment complex near Verkhoyansk, part of the Sakha Republic within the Russian Federation. SCP-1984 was placed within a standard humanoid containment cell, which was itself held within a Faraday cage, a type of enclosure constructed with or covered in conductive material designed to block electromagnetic fields. This was done to block any external broadcast signals from reaching SCP-1984, and thus causing it to manifest its other form if it learned of an impending attack on Russia, even a fictional one, perhaps as a part of a television broadcast. As part of the Dead Hand's containment, all signals broadcast near its cage are to be monitored, and only broadcasts featuring doctored information would reach the entity. Thankfully to the work of the SCP Foundation's Information Control Team, SCP-1984 is drip-fed a stream of carefully fabricated information. Using on-site equipment and facilities, a team of military historians, economists, actors, and Soviet media specialists, the Information Control Team have created an ongoing narrative wherein the Cold War never ended. Through falsified radio and television broadcasts made to look like era-appropriated news organizations, they managed to keep SCP-1984 convinced that the nuclear stalemate between the Soviet Union and United States is still ongoing. Unfortunately, sometimes information from the real world is able to bleed through. An incident involving SCP-1984 occurred on August 8, 1984, and almost brought forth a full-scale nuclear war. While preparing for a campaign speech, the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, uttered the following joke.
I am pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
Naturally, thousands of media outlets reported on this, but signals of those broadcasts, including recordings of the president's remark, made their way to SCP-1984. Foundation researchers were both unsure of how these transmissions breached the Faraday cage surrounding the Dead Hand, and were unable to prevent what happened next. Hearing what it could only assume was a genuine declaration of war, the manifestation of the SCP-1984-01 entity happened immediately after Reagan's words reached its containment cell. This time, the entity appeared as a semi-transparent woman, withered and blue, wearing traditional Pashtun dress. Armed personnel guarding SCP-1984's cage engaged the entity, causing it to retaliate, lashing out and attacking any that stood in its way. One captain and 2 privates that suffered the brunt of SCP-1984's offensive capabilities began bleeding heavily from their ears, seizing violently. Most gruesomely of all, a liquid leaked from their eyes and nose believed to have been cerebrospinal fluid. While armed personnel attempted to use microwave-emitting weaponry to slow the entity down, the Information Control Team was frantically trying to record a new falsified broadcast, in the hopes that SCP-1984 would cease its hostilities and the entity would dissipate before it was able to travel at high speed to any nearby Soviet nuclear facilities and begin bombarding the United States. Their first attempt to record a new broadcast that would result in a cessation of SCP-1984's slaughter of its guards was interrupted when a nearby wall collapsed. Desperate to recontain the creature, The information control team tried to film the broadcast a second time and succeeded, although one of the actors portraying a newsreader suffered a stroke and had to be edited out to convince the dead hand of its supposed authenticity. What followed was a short news clip, clarifying that Russia's Politburo was in on President Reagan's joke, including old footage of the USSR's General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko, confirming that the Soviet Union's nuclear forces were not on high alert. Miraculously, after 15 more minutes of sustained fighting with guards, SCP-1984's physical manifestation began to disappear, gradually dematerializing while it seemed to attack with far less intensity. Eventually, containment was reestablished, at the cost of the deaths of 17 members of Foundation staff, both guards and researchers. A further 8, however, suffered traumatic brain injuries that left them all permanently disabled. The one upside is that this incident remains the only time SCP-1984 has ever breached its containment and caused harm to others. And considering that it could very well have launched Russia's nuclear arsenal, the casualties could easily have been much higher. So remember, folks, don't joke about nuclear weapons, especially if you're the president. You never know what anomalies lurking in the bodies of dead Russian soldiers might be listening, and if they are, you'd better hope they have a sense of humor. On the 13th of October 1989, the town of Danner, Wisconsin was shaken by a seismic event unlike anything they'd ever experienced. This might have been written off as an earthquake, were it not for one disturbing factor. The ground-shaking event was accompanied by a huge spike of radioactivity, with the strange phenomenon happening a month before the Berlin Wall was torn down, during a period of the Cold War that historians call the Year of Crisis. It's easy to understand why the people of Danner immediately assumed the worst, but the huge eruption they felt wasn't the result of a nuclear bomb going off. The SCP Foundation was alerted to the event in Danner when they picked up a series of radio transmissions coming from just outside the town. When they arrived, they found something incredible, like something out of a sci-fi movie. Standing at the quake's epicenter was a creature that looked to be from another world. Standing 2 meters tall and weighing almost 300 kilograms, the being was green and brown in color with a bulky humanoid body. Its head was a different story though, and resembled a gigantic housefly with a proboscis and huge stereoscopic eyes. Surprisingly, the strange creature did not immediately go on a rampage. Instead, the being, designated SCP-2273, appeared to be exhausted, injured, and extremely malnourished. It offered no resistance at all to the Foundation containment team, and it was taken to Site-17 without conflict. While the SCP Foundation is no stranger to visitors from other worlds, there was something especially unusual about this supposed alien invader. The doctors who examined the creature and treated its injuries found an appendage that seemed to function as an organic radio transmitter, and large open wounds on its shoulder blades and forearms where further appendages had been ripped off. Additionally, while its insect-like exoskeleton was mostly a uniform green and brown pattern, the creature's upper arms and torso were dotted with a variety of scars and markings that, on closer inspection, looked like military badges. Was this some kind of wounded intergalactic soldier who had been stranded on Earth? If it was, then how were the organic badges on this alien's exoskeleton a near-perfect match to military badges worn by soldiers in the Soviet Union? Even if they did reference a unit that didn't officially exist within the Soviet Army, the scientists were sure this alien wasn't an alien at all. Underneath its exoskeleton was a non-anomalous human being. If that was true, then this was even more terrifying than an extraterrestrial visitor. The scientists were sure that the USSR had developed a new kind of organic armor, and this anomaly showing up in Wisconsin was the result of a test on US soil that had gone wrong. If that was the case, then there was no telling how many more of these exoskeletons were out there and would need to be contained. The Foundation had to act quickly and find out more. While SCP-2273 was recovering, they called in Dr. Friedrich, an on-site psychologist who could speak several languages including Russian. Dr. Friedrich would be tasked with interrogating the SCP on his origins and the nature of the suit. The interview was conducted via AM radio from a separate observation chamber, as the biological transmitter seemed to be SCP-2273's only method of communication. The interview began with Dr. Friedrich speaking to SCP-2273 in Russian, only for 2273 to respond that Dr. Friedrich's accent was atrocious and requesting he use German instead. SCP-2273, who, according to the organic military patches on his body, was named Major Alexei Belitrov, initially resisted being interviewed. He believed that he was a prisoner of war, being held by the American military. According to him, he had been in the middle of battle, and that the Americans had killed his men and left him for dead in the wilderness. Nothing that Dr. Friedrich told him, that there was no war or that the Foundation was not affiliated with the US government, could convince him otherwise, and he refused to talk further. Before a second interview was conducted, Belitrov was given an old copy of the Level 1 Researcher General Debrief as a way of helping him further understand the nature of the Foundation and his containment. Belitrov was more cooperative after that, though the realization that he would most likely be kept in containment for the rest of his life caused him great distress, and he was unwilling to speak to Dr. Friedrich for another 3 days. Dr. Friedrich didn't give up though, and when Belitrov finally opened up to the doctor, he began to tell him more and more. Belitrov told the doctor that when he was a child, Russia was hit by an American nuclear warhead, and that the Soviet Union immediately retaliated. The resulting nuclear conflict, which Belitrov called the War to End the World, caused massive devastation and left most of the planet dangerously irradiated. That is why he had the exoskeleton. It was to shield him from the radiation and allow him to survive above ground. Unfortunately, Belitrov knew very little about how the suit was made or how it worked, saying that it was built by the engineers and that it grew naturally over a period of several years. But Belitrov hadn't made the decision himself. It was his parents who had volunteered him as a test subject for the exoskeleton suit program when he was still young, hoping it would give him a better chance at survival. The process of bonding the exoskeleton to the human body was extremely painful, but according to Belitrov, its advantages far outweighed the pain. The suit not only helped him survive in a nuclear wasteland, but made him a better soldier. The suit allowed him to lift and carry up to 1,200 kilograms, gave him stereoscopic vision, and the organic radio transmitter allowed him to communicate with other soldiers across long distances, as well as listen in on encrypted enemy transmissions. The wounds on his shoulders and arms, where it looked like appendages had been ripped out, were where his weapons and supply packs had previously been mounted. Belitrov had been stationed with his men in the area he was discovered when they were attacked by American soldiers. The soldiers had ripped off Belitrov's weapons and supply pack, and did the same to all his men as well. They were all shot, with Belitrov being spared for the moment only because the Americans had identified him as the commanding officer. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, and the American soldiers vanished. Not only that, but the landscape changed. Where there had been a post-nuclear wasteland before, now there were lush green trees. Injured and disoriented, Belitrov began sending distress signals, only to have those signals intercepted by the SCP Foundation. The most interesting part of Belitrov's story, as far as the Foundation was concerned, came during his 4th interview, when Dr. Friedrich asked him about the engineers who had designed the exoskeleton suit. In Belitrov's own words, "They weren't truly known to man until the years of the Great War and the Revolution. The French found them in buried cities where the Western Allies were digging their trenches. Eventually, they were made to build weapons for the war by both sides." By his description, these engineers didn't sound human, but they were by no means unknown to the SCP Foundation. Belitrov described the engineers as humanoid, nocturnal, covered in fur, and possessing technology and intelligence far beyond that of any human. Those familiar with the Foundation's history might already know the engineers by their Foundation designation of SCP-1000, or their more commonly known name, Bigfoot. A quick rundown. SCP-1000 are a species of intelligent humanoid primates that lived alongside humanity in highly advanced cities until their own technology was turned against them. Not only were their cities wiped off the face of the earth, but 70% of their population was slaughtered, and the survivors were driven mad to the point that their mental faculties were no higher than those of a chimpanzee or gorilla. The SCP Foundation is tasked with keeping them away from human contact, in fear of what the creatures would be able to do to humanity if they ever regained their memories and full mental function, and rumors have been spread about them possessing deadly anomalous properties. But evidently, the destruction of the SCP-1000 species never occurred in Belitrov's universe, or if it did, it wasn't nearly as complete. In that timeline, humanity regained contact with SCP-1000 after discovering their underground cities sometime during World War I. After this discovery, both Allied and Axis powers began recruiting them to build weapons, and their weapons played a role in both the Russian Revolution and the Second World War. It was because of these technological advantages that the Cold War escalated into what would become the war to end all wars. Both sides were armed with not only nuclear warheads, but highly advanced radiation-proof exoskeleton armor that allowed the conflict to continue even after the total destruction of the planet. While the humans fought above ground, life continued as normal for SCP-1000 in their underground cities. As Belitrov noted, they never wore the armor themselves, as they had no need to venture above ground.
Only soldiers wear armor, and this is not their war.
Belitrov continued to adjust to life in containment and sitting for regular interviews with Dr. Friedrich. He was given the rations provided for humanoid anomalies, but in much larger quantities, as the suit required him to eat around 8,000 calories a day to keep it functioning. Belitrov also began taking advantage of his ability to access the Foundation's library. He would often read or listen to classical music, particularly by the Russian composer Tchaikovsky. He seemed especially fond of reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. No surprise, given he was able to directly relate to the experience of living through an apocalypse and being transported to a strange timeline with no way to return home. But with little else to occupy his time, Belitrov began to display symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, reporting in his now regular interviews with Dr. Friedrich that he was constantly reliving memories of the battles he'd fought and the lives he had taken in combat. The suit was making the problems worse too, it seemed. It was as if he could never forget, as one of its features was an ability to store and replay memories. This feature was intended as a strategic aid that would allow commanding officers to more effectively gather and process information about their surroundings. But outside of combat, this only served to force Belitrov into reliving his most painful memories again and again. Every night as he tried to sleep, he would see the faces of his men, their weapons torn from their exoskeletons, laying in the dirt after being gunned down by the enemy. Like many veterans, Belitrov was being hit all at once with the harsh realities of war. Now that his brain wasn't solely focused on keeping him alive, it had time to process all the horrors he'd experienced. He told Dr. Friedrich,
"I trained alongside these men for years before they put us back on the surface. Since we were all young children, we were brothers, and I gave them the order to surrender and got them killed. I should have died with them."
While the story of SCP-2273 ends here, the story of Alexei Belitrov, SCP-2273-1 continues. In 2018, Belitrov was allowed passage to Volgograd, Russia, as part of an anomaly reintegration program. While he was unable to secure employment within the Russian government as he had hoped, he eventually was taken in by a monastery and continued to write letters to Dr. Friedrich until Friedrich's eventual death from lymphoma-related complications. There's plenty more on the monastery, the anomaly reintegration program, and what happened to Major Belitrov when he returned to Russia, but that will have to be a story for another day.
Okay, just hear me out. What if we shot it into the sun?
Foster asked excitedly. You are aware just how far away the sun actually is, right? His fellow researcher Reese replied, sighing with exhaustion at their lengthy conversation. They had been discussing this for so long that the food on both their trays had gone unappetizingly cold.
Obviously, but okay, think about it. We'd be sending it into a perpetually burning nuclear furnace. There is no way it would be able to survive.
Researcher Foster rebutted, standing by his latest harebrained theory.
We'd send it up into a rocket fully automated so no personnel have to put themselves in harm's way and sacrifice their lives, then boom, it flies into the sun, problem solved.
So, it never occurred to you that 682 might figure out a way to escape on the 150 million kilometer journey? Reese poked at his mashed potatoes with a fork out of boredom. You're forgetting how intelligent the thing is. It might be an omnicidal killing machine, but it's as smart as either of us. Well, one of us, to say the least. Sitting opposite each other in the mess hall, Researcher Foster and Researcher Reese kept up their bickering, debating on what would be the best way to neutralize SCP-682, the infamous, hard-to-destroy reptile. It was a discussion nearly every member of Foundation personnel had been a part of at least once. How could they kill this unkillable beast? What other anomalies were they yet to try and use against it? Even after countless tests, most leading to numerous containment breaches and significant loss of life, the Foundation seemed to be no closer to putting a definitive end to SCP-682. But while Reese and Foster debated more and more outlandish possibilities, someone was sitting nearby, listening in on every word. At a table, all by himself in the mess hall, a man in typical Foundation security officer garb was quietly scrawling everything the pair of researchers were saying on a notepad. The photo identification and name tag he wore on his uniform identified him as one Elias Anderson, a long-serving member of the SCP Foundation, with an extensive service record logged in their personal database. Of course, that name and the whole identity were just a cover. The real Officer Elias Anderson was dead, his body being kept on ice, hidden in a morgue within a secure black site. It hadn't taken long for the man now wearing Anderson's uniform and using his name to update the officer's photo with one of his own face in the Foundation's database, keeping his subterfuge so far undetected. Gathering up his notepad, casually hiding it under his tray as he stood up and walking towards the mess hall exit, the unknown infiltrator made his way to the nearest elevator, riding it up to the highest level, making sure any other passengers had gotten out on other floors. The security officer flipped the emergency stop switch. He reached into his pocket, retrieving a jury-rigged handheld communication device, and began sending a message on a secure channel. "Agent Parados checking in," he wrote. "The SCP Foundation is still bickering amongst themselves about the best way to eliminate the target. SCP-682 remains contained but alive. Advise best course of action." The cursor on screen blinked for a few seconds, awaiting a response. "Excellent work, Agent." The reply from GOC Command finally arrived, lines of text scrolling rapidly across the screen. "As long as this anomaly is allowed to live, it poses an ever-present life to all threat on Earth. What is your assessment of the Foundation's approach to termination?" Parados thought to himself for a moment before sending back, "They're overthinking it." "Affirmative," the Coalition wrote. "Have the O5 Council still denied termination of SCP-682 via nuclear weapons?" The undercover agent quickly responded, confirming that this was indeed still the case. There was another pause, almost like the whole GOC was thinking carefully about what to do next. "Global Occult Coalition executives have conferred in private to authorize a hammer-down operation to eliminate the anomaly known as SCP-682. Came the follow-up from Command. An F-22 Raptor fixed with a 60-megaton payload will be launched at 0600, bound for the following coordinates. A map reference quickly followed, the longitude and latitude of a large empty area of the Pacific Ocean. Agent Parados, your new objective is to lure the creature into the open by any means necessary. GOC out. Slipping the communicator back into his pocket, Parados unclicked the elevator's stop switch and pressed one of the numbered floor buttons. He already knew which one would take him back down to 682's containment cell, and what to do when he got there. The commotion was unlike anything Parados had ever seen before. Alarms were blaring so loud that the sound was ringing in his ears. Most of the research staff were fleeing for their lives, while heavily armed Mobile Task Force operatives in tactical gear were moving in formation to support the security personnel. Some had abandoned their posts out of sheer terror, desperately looking for anywhere they could hide in order to stay alive. Under the ear-splitting wail of alerts was a cacophony of chaos, a mix of hailing gunfire from the MTF's weapons, the crumble of walls as the facility around them was being torn apart, and the angered, vicious roars of the rampaging reptile. All hands were on deck. The Foundation, while always on high alert, had been caught completely unprepared for a containment breach. SCP-682 was making short work of any living personnel in its path, carving them up with its claws or devouring them while they were still alive, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in its wake. Any survivors on site were quickly instructed to retreat into the command center, and Parados casually slid in alongside a gaggle of panicked researchers. He recognized one of them from the mess hall, Researcher Foster, wide-eyed and disassociating in shock, the blood of his colleague Reese still wet on his face and lab coat. The outer doors of the command center were locked down, while all efforts inside were put towards coordinating the recontainment effort, tracking the escaped anomaly's movements via a live satellite feed. Agent Parados had to think and act fast. The hard-to-destroy reptile was already making its way towards water, where GOC fighter jets would enrage it in order to make the anomaly follow them to the target area. But if the Foundation had a chance to recapture SCP-682, his entire mission would be declared a failure. Checking that nobody was watching, Parado snuck over to a computer terminal. Looking underneath, he located a panel and unscrewed it as quickly and inconspicuously as he could. Reaching for his communicator, he put the device into one of the ports underneath the terminal, and it instantly went to work installing proprietary software that would block any outbound Foundation communication.
Hey!
Foster stammered, spotting Parado sabotaging the terminal.
Hey, what is he doing?
Within moments, the researcher had gained the attention of the surviving security personnel, who rushed over and tackled the saboteur. The officers restrained Parados, one grabbing each of his arms as they held him in place. But it was too late. Communication suddenly went offline, cutting the command center off from the rest of the Foundation.
Who are you?
One of the security guards yelled over and over again, punching the infiltrator in the gut each time.
Who do you work for?
Fighting through the pain, Parados had kept his jaw clenched so tightly that he could feel his teeth grinding together like they were about to crack.
We still have access to all saved internal data.
One of the Foundation technicians, a man named Baxter, chimed in after examining the computer terminal.
According to this security footage, he's the one who sprung 682. Do we still have no comms?
Foster asked timidly, still trying to wipe Reese's blood off of his coat.
Negative,
the technician answered.
Whatever this device is, it's deactivated every way we have to transmit. We can still receive, though.
His voice trailed off, reducing to match the low silence that was now filling the command center. Everyone in the room, including the restrained Agent Parados, had gradually turned to face the massive screens, displaying the satellite footage of SCP-682. It was small, but visible, thanks to how zoomed in the orbital lens was. The hard-to-destroy reptile had reached the water and was making its way across the ocean. At the same time, the bird's-eye feed of the Pacific showed something else, a tiny winged object barreling through the air at almost supersonic speeds.
That's a fighter jet,
one of the security guards declared, breaking the tense silence.
Probably a Raptor by the looks of it.
It was, in fact, a fighter jet speeding towards SCP-682. The creature seemed unaware of the aircraft. It was merely traveling in the opposite direction, but the pair were on a direct course with each other, bound to meet at any moment now. Something ejected from the F-22 that exact moment it passed over the hard-to-destroy reptile, followed almost instantly by a bright flash of light. A huge explosion engulfed the area of the ocean where the creature had been, a ball of radioactive fire in the middle of the water. The Foundation personnel in the command center watched in horror at the nuclear detonation, holding their breath, dreading what they would see when the mushroom cloud dissipated.
He's with the Coalition,
the nearest security guard realized, referring to Parados. It was well known amongst the staff that the SCP Foundation maintained a somewhat fragile alliance with the Global Occult Coalition. While they had historically worked together when their goals aligned, the GOC were more intent on destroying anomalies wholesale, wiping them from existence in order to protect the United Nations and peoples of the world. The Foundation, on the other hand, although never afraid to get their hands dirty, but more of an emphasis on containment and study of anomalies rather than outright extermination.
What the hell have you done, you maniac?
Yelled one of the doctors trapped in the command center.
That monstrosity needed to be eliminated,
Parados argued back.
While you were wasting your time keeping it submerged in acid, ready for it to break out again and start slaughtering people, we acted. And look for yourselves, it worked. You should be thanking the GOC and me, because it turns out 682 wasn't invincible after all.
No, it isn't, Foster spoke up.
Reese and I were talking about it earlier. He said 682's greatest strength isn't being invulnerable, it's being adaptable. It can change itself, mutate in response to damage or in order to survive a hostile environment, and you haven't killed it. You've allowed it to adapt to a nuclear weapon.
On the screens, something burst from underneath the water. The overhead view from the satellite feed filled the display, an image of a dark, rocky surface.
Who zoomed in on the feed? Pull it back!
Baxter announced, trying to hide what they were all afraid of now. That the footage wasn't zoomed in at all, it was just looking at something much bigger now. As the camera zoomed out, increasing its field of view, what looked like a dark surface on screen now looked to be a huge mass of scales. The satellite feed pulled further back, revealing the full extent of what was now standing in the Pacific Ocean. It was SCP-682, not only still alive, but much, much bigger than before. The creature had adapted to the intense heat of the nuclear payload that had been dropped on it.
soaking up the bomb's radiation and using it as a way to increase its body mass several million times over.
It looks like we have, Baxter said, dumbfounded, eyes widen in horror.
Kaiju on our hands.
Parados stared up at the screen, looking at the monstrous reptile now so much bigger than before. Even from the satellite's current overhead angle, SCP-682 looked like it could now tower over most buildings, save for maybe occasionally tall skyscrapers. What's more, the creature was now thrashing and roaring in the ocean, entering an enraged state now infinitely more devastating thanks to its newfound size. And it was all Parados' fault.
Hey! Foster yelled at the restrained GOC operative. We need to get the word out, and the rest of the facility is still on lockdown. Whatever you did to disable communications, reverse it. What good would that do?
Parados asked in a blind panic.
Look at the size of that abomination now. It'll wipe us all out.
Oh God, what have I done?
The agent was shocked into silence by a sudden slap. The timid researcher Foster had struck him sharply across the face.
Cry about it later. This is on you. But do you want to be part of the solution or keep being part of the problem?
Foster yelled, gripping Parados by the collar. I can't reverse it, he replied. I blocked all outbound Foundation transmissions. My comm device is the only thing that wasn't affected.
Good enough,
Foster said, holding a handout to Baxter, who passed him the confiscated GOC tech.
Then you're going to contact the Coalition for us. What for? The Foundation has a joint project we've been working on with them and High Brazil for just this sort of occasion,
the researcher stated, holding out the device to Agent Parados as the security finally released his arms.
If there was ever a time we needed it, it's now.
Wait, you mean... Parados finally realized what Foster meant. You're talking about the Dragon Slayer, aren't you? The next hour flew by. Time seemed to be moving faster as the newly mutated SCP-682 swam through the waters of the Pacific. It was traveling in the northwest direction, the collection of Foundation personnel still locked in the command center having projected that it was heading for the nearest landmass, which meant it would reach Hawaii at any moment. Throughout the entire time, Foster, Parados, and Baxter were sending urgent communiques to the Global Occult Coalition, trying to get them to cooperate and engage in contact with the wider SCP Foundation beyond the facility they were currently stuck in. Not one of them knew which was harder, trying to kill an unkillable lizard that had absorbed a nuclear blast, or trying to force the GOC and Foundation to work together without arguing over whose fault this whole mess was. All the while, the towering monstrous reptilian form of SCP-682 was getting closer and closer to its destination. Drawing itself up to its full enlarged height, SCP-682 roared, large enough to block out sunlight and cast an ominous shadow over the Hawaiian coastline. Onlookers watched in terror as the hard-to-destroy reptile rose from the water, bearing down on their shores with the intent to slaughter every living thing on the island. Then, just as SCP-682 neared the landmass, the creature paused. It could hear something getting closer, getting louder as it approached from behind. No, above. And with it came the sound of someone reciting poetry. Before the creature could turn to face its attacker, the piercing metal of the cold iron sword plunged through its scaly back and out through its front. The hard-to-destroy reptile roared at the searing pain of the stab wound, whipping its tail as it thrashed in its fury. Something heavy and metallic deflected a swipe at the creature's tail. It was a huge, robotic arm of a gigantic, mechanized titan. It was SCP-5514, the Dragon Slayer. Controlled by its skilled pilots with a swift, fluid motion, SCP-5514 delivered a brutal backhanded strike to the reptile's snout, staggering the beast while also withdrawing its mighty cold iron sword at the same time. SCP-682 growled in discontent. Even its infamously adaptable healing abilities were halted by a wound from the Dragon Slayer's blade. Watched by the innocent civilians on the island and the Foundation through their satellite above, the kaiju-killing mech assumed a battle-ready stance as the hard-to-destroy reptile reeled back to roar. The moment it opened its sharp-toothed jaws, a fiery atomic blast came spewing forth from SCP-682. It had adapted not only to withstand the nuclear weapon the GOC had used on it, but also developed the ability to unleash a burst of radioactive fire. Within the Dragon Slayer, the pilots braced for impact as the blast struck the outer armor of the mech. Thankfully, through the conceptual engineering used when building it, SCP-5514 was welded to the Earth itself, as well as the very concept of humanity's resilience. That gave it just enough protection against the onslaught of SCP-682's newfound ability.
Holding up one arm to defend itself, the Dragon Slayer reached upwards for its rounded, recoiling plasma, the disc it wore as a hat with its free hand. With a spin, it flung the razor-edged weapon at SCP-682 like a frisbee. It collided with the hard-to-destroy reptile, still unleashing its nuclear fire breath, and staggered the crocodilian creature for just a moment, causing its blast to stop. SCP-5514's pilots commanded the mech to charge forward, as the rounded, recoiling plasma disc spun back through the air and returned to the Dragon Slayer's hand thanks to its built-in electromagnets. Within the robotic vehicle, the 1,000-word arrows were still loudly reciting their poetry. The mech's strangest weapon was a group of 7 people who would rhyme and chant about the death and defeat of the large-scale monsters SCP-5514 was designed to fight. Their voices were being blared out of the Dragon Slayer at loud enough volume to enrage SCP-682 further. It roared again, and then started rushing towards its adversary, the pair of colossal combatants seemingly charging into a head-on collision. As it placed one mechanical foot before the other, huge splashes erupting as its feet impacted the surface of the ocean, the Dragon Slayer opened fire. The Beowulf Sigurd railgun mounted on its shoulder began launching electromagnetic energy bolts at SCP-682. The weapon used anomalously altered gravity to blast its targets. With each hit, the energy projectiles seared through the outer scales of the hard-to-destroy reptile, while making the towering creature dramatically heavier. Each projectile impacted at super-terminal velocities, making SCP-682's already enlarged body feel heavier and slower with every hit. Each step it took seemed to sink deeper under the ocean, waves lapping at the reptile's damaged scales, sea salt washing over its gaping wounds. By the time it was about to clash with the Dragon Slayer, the hard-to-destroy reptile felt such huge forces of additional weight acting on it that its whole body was being pushed further and further below sea level, feet sinking heavily into the seafloor below. Still standing upright, SCP-5514 raised its cold iron sword and brought it down in one fell swoop, cleaving the creature's head from its shoulders before wasting no time slicing up what was left of its nuclear-enlarged body. Before long, an area of the Pacific Ocean was red with SCP-682's blood. Victorious for now, the Dragon Slayer began gathering up the remains of the hard-to-destroy reptile before it had a chance to reform its body. From the command center, the Foundation personnel cheered and whooped excitedly. Even Agent Parados found himself overwhelmed with relief. Although he'd been sent with the intention of assisting them in killing the hard-to-destroy reptile, the mission that the GOC had sent him on had only made the creature more of a threat. For now, at least, it was defeated, although Parados' celebration of the fact was cut short when one of the Foundation doctors tapped him on the shoulder.
"Excuse me, GOC Agent Parados, isn't it?" the man asked. "My name's Dr. Bright, and this here's my associate, Dr. Clef. We'd like to have a word with you about the, incident you just caused."
The diver screams a silent scream as the giant squid's beak digs into his skin, its many grasping tentacles grabbing him and holding him in place. Nearby, his fellow divers are driven half-mad with terror as they see mysterious figures floating towards them through the murk, and strange Russian voices speaking in their heads. Nobody can help them. They're down too deep, too consumed by the darkness and the pressure of the sea. They're now at the mercy of whatever is inside the submarine. Beginning in the 1940s, with the dawn of nuclear weapons, the American government conducting the world's first atomic weapons test, and the Soviet Union responding in kind with nuclear testing of their own, the two powers entered an arms race fueled by rivalry and a thirst to prove their strength on the world stage. What followed were decades of staggering technological advancements as each nation tried to outdo and intimidate the other. The Soviet Union crossed into the cold reaches of outer space, deploying the satellite Sputnik. The United States responded with the founding of NASA. Tensions reached a fever pitch during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, as United States citizens feared they were teetering on the brink of nuclear war. In July of 1968, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States came together to sign the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, agreeing to abandon their pursuit of increasing nuclear power and turn their focus to disarmament. But several months before the treaty was signed, the Soviet government was dealing in weaponry far more dangerous than nuclear missiles, something the other world powers knew nothing about. These deadly secrets were hidden aboard a submarine known as SCP-041. SCP-041 is the underwater wreckage of a Soviet submarine that sank in March of 1968 and came into the custody of the SCP Foundation in 1999. The submarine, a version of the Charlie II class, was deployed under unusual circumstances, which attracted the attention of the United States government. In an attempt to learn more about the submarine, the US government launched Project Redacted, which attempted to recover the vessel from the ocean in the early 1970s. They managed to recover a few pieces of the vessel, though the specifics are highly classified. In the late 1990s, the US government contacted the SCP Foundation, informing them of a possible Euclid or Keter-class anomaly in the wreck. At this point, it passed into the custody and surveillance of the Foundation. The submarine is on the ocean floor, broken into 3 pieces. The hull was broken into bits during Project Redacted recovery attempt, but was largely intact when it first sank except for 2 holes, one just in front of the sail and one just below the starboard missile tubes. Apparently, the vessel sank rapidly due to flooding after an enemy missile strike, which occurred while it was surfacing. Though all parts of the submarine are accounted for, no members of the crew have been located. Additionally, none of the emergency escape equipment on board has been used, raising further questions about what became of the crew. Wherever they went, they seem to have left something behind. Whenever divers are sent down to investigate the wreckage, they report experiencing anomalous currents and strange sea life, and hearing moans, disembodied voices, and incoherent whispering. They also report seeing blurry, faintly glowing figures. Additionally, the ocean life in the area is unnaturally aggressive, particularly large squid and sharks. This effect was first noted during a manned expedition into the waters around the wreckage, described in Incident Report 1741-A. Divers A-26 through A-30 embarked from the icebreaker Yamal into the waters below with the intention of studying the potential anomalous activity surrounding the wreckage. As the group of divers approached the submarine, they could feel the shift in the water around them, the oppressive feeling of abnormally increasing pressure bearing down and threatening to crush them. If their specialized diving equipment were to fail, they knew that that would be it, and the command would have to come and fish their corpses out of the water. Or even worse, they would vanish entirely, meeting the same mysterious fate as the crew of that doomed submarine. But they couldn't fixate on that. They had a job to do. At first glance, the wreckage appeared undisturbed, unchanged since the previous inspection. Still, they needed to take a closer look to be sure. As the team got closer to the vessel, A-30 was startled by the sight of movement from within the wreckage, spotting motion through one of the holes in the structure as something passed by. He pointed it out to his colleagues, but they dismissed it as likely a giant isopod or spider crab, which were crawling all over the surrounding area. A-30 laughed off his jumpiness, agreed that they were probably right, and continued the exploration as planned. Control authorized the divers to proceed to the next step, and A-29 activated sonar and lights, moving toward the starboard side breach. There, a faint glowing caught his eye. The glow resembled that of radioactive material, but when the team checked the radiation levels in the area, they remained stable. Whatever the source of the glow was, it wasn't radioactive. At this point, his neutron counter began to register something, and all of a sudden, a disembodied voice could be heard saying, "Vasily Yevgeny, can you hear me?" The voice was muffled, and though it could be heard over their communication channels, it emanated from somewhere in the wreckage, deep, deep underwater. As A-29 watched, a glowing shape emerged from the darkness. It was only an outline, the suggestion of a silhouette, but the shape was undeniably familiar. It looked like a person. The other divers quickly noted the apparition too and began to panic. Some checked their nitrogen levels, believing it to be some sort of nitrogen narcosis, while others pointed out that they couldn't all be suffering from nitrogen narcosis at the same time. The unknown voice continued speaking, saying, "Help me, it is getting hard to breathe." The divers debated what to do next, questioning whether what they were seeing was even real, when all at once, the humanoid figure vanished from sight. The divers attempted to shake off the startling encounter, and they resumed their duties, the investigation proceeding as normal. After a few moments of uneventful work, another interruption presented itself in the form of a 5-meter-long squid swimming around the wreckage. Its presence startled the divers at first, particularly those closest to the animal, but the others encouraged them to ignore it, citing the fact that there are no records of these squid attacking humans. So they did, continuing their work as the squids circled them with apparent curiosity. A-27 spotted an unusual shell below the wreckage, notably large and difficult to identify, and Control requested that they bring it up to the surface for further inspection by a marine biologist. The diver began attaching haul cables to the shell as the squid crept closer and closer. All of a sudden, A-26 screamed, and there was a sudden bloom of blood in the water. The squid, despite it being uncharacteristic behavior for its species, attacked the diver, biting him savagely. Prompted by cries for help from the diving team, Control began to reel A-26 back towards the surface, proceeding slowly to give him decompression time, and the squid took advantage of the slow retreat. It chased after the diver, grabbing hold of him and biting down again, tearing away at him as it gripped him in its tentacles. Still, Control continued reeling him in, hoping to free him from the squid's grasp as they yanked him to the surface. The other divers were ordered to get themselves out of there as fast as possible, an order they gladly obeyed. As they swam back to the surface, A-30 saw something else moving in the depths. He couldn't make out what it was, but the sight of it gave him a sick feeling of dread deep in the pit of his stomach. The 4 divers were recovered alive, along with the shell. Examination of the shell indicated that it resembled that of the extinct orthoconic nautiloids, but it was not fossilized. It was taken for further study, given the possible implication of extinct species anomalously manifesting in the vicinity of SCP-714. Diver A-26 lost a limb and was exposed to an unknown venom via bites from the attacking squid. His camera was destroyed in the process. As squid are not known to attack humans unprovoked, this behavior has been attributed to the influence of SCP-741, though the exact link between the two is yet to be determined. An anomalous pressure gradient surrounds the wreck with a radius of approximately 250 meters, starting around the center of the submarine. The pressure in this area is much greater than it should be, given the depth of the waters there. This unusually high pressure makes sonar analysis extremely difficult, as well as threatening the safety of any divers in the vicinity of the wreck. The few records that the Foundation has managed to obtain from the Russian and US governments indicate that the submarine was being used to transport some sort of secret cargo. Though the specifics of this cargo are still unknown, there is reason to believe that it differed from any type of nuclear or chemical weaponry. On a date redacted from official files, the SCPs Basisti was patrolling the area around SCP-741 when its sonar detected some unknown entity approaching SCP-741 from the south at a pace of 46 knots. The crew compared the acoustic signature of the contact with known submarines and torpedoes, but could not find a match. The Basisti attempted to reach the contact via sonobuoy drops and active sonar pings, but it did not respond. When the contact crossed into the total underwater exclusion zone, it became classified as hostile. At that point, the sonar recorded sounds of an undersea missile launch, and Basisti responded with the utmost urgency. The ship broke away from its original area and fired a Type 53 torpedo at the underwater threat. 15 seconds after the Basisti launched its torpedo, missiles of an unidentified configuration were seen breaking the water, flying at a height of 1.8 meters and a velocity of 0.92 Mach. The missiles did not emit any detectable radar, nor did they respond to any launch chaff or flares from the Basisti. Both of the missiles were engaged by Basisti's 3KN-5 Kinsul surface-to-air missiles and Kashtan point defense systems, and were destroyed at 1,800 meters and 210 meters from impact, respectively. After the missiles were neutralized, the hostile vessel could be heard engaging in evasive maneuvers. At this point, there were 4 closely spaced explosions and the sound of a submarine disintegrating. The identity of the attacker, as well as its intention toward SCP-741, have not yet been determined. The incident resulted in the Foundation research team suggesting an expansion of the acoustic sensor net, as well as additional patrol and defense assets placed in the area. Additionally, they advised an acquisition of undersea retaliatory capability. The incident was classified Incident 1741-C. The sonar recordings from the SCPs Basisti during Incident 1741-C were taken for further analysis by the research team. The in-depth review revealed anomalous acoustic signatures that did not match up with any known forms of propulsion, including magnetohydrodynamic drive, Currently, the nature of the unidentified attacker remains a mystery, and it has not been attributed to any particular government or organization. Following the incident involving the SCP-001-UBU, an American intelligence agent reached out to the Foundation, offering further insight into the secretive government programs looking into SCP-741. He agreed to sit for an interview with a Foundation researcher assigned to the project, on the condition that his identity remain protected. The SCP researcher's name is absent from the official file as well. The two men sat in a Foundation interview room, and the interviewer asked his informant why he chose to come forward, given the US government had simply chosen to sit on this information for 30 years. You've seen those reports. Project Redacted. Now we know that part too. How the directors didn't make the connection is beyond me. That and the stuff the Redacted pulled up, yeah, the other part you don't hear about is what some of the research team died of. And the crewmen we buried? Just uniforms. Also, the nuclear device we recovered wasn't a missile or torpedo warhead. It was a demolition charge. Does that make any sense? After all those clues, I had to come forward. Why the directorate didn't is something I can't fully explain. This particular statement puzzled the Foundation researcher, raising questions he hadn't anticipated. Only uniforms? Did this mean that the sub had been unmanned? The informant replied, No, not unmanned. There were no bodies, but personal effects were everywhere, along with uniforms. There was some blood, human. Before you ask, on one of the torpedoes and a bit of skin where somebody probably crushed his hand loading the thing. Just no bodies left. When I first looked into all this, I had no clue what the hell had gone on down there, but I started putting things together. The Foundation agent began to speculate based on the mounting evidence. Could it have been a Soviet weapons program? A deadly biological agent of some kind? No, it wasn't that. I thought maybe it could have been, so I dialed up some of my contacts at Biopreparant. Us spies wind up owing each other favors after a while, and they denied it vehemently. Not your usual cover-up baloney either. They clearly stated that whatever the sub was carrying, it wasn't theirs. They wanted no part of it. Sounded like he was gonna puke when I mentioned Redacted. Doctor, do you have any idea what it takes to make a bioweapons researcher sick? Now that wasn't what really bugged me though. What really kept me awake at night was the KGB file that fell into our hands. They mentioned a covert op by the Soviet military against an internal unnamed faction to get rid of a, quote, terrifying weapons that even the Soviet Union can't safely control. They wanted to lose it, whatever it was, or maybe fob it off onto the US. Of course, that all came to light right before the Iron Curtain fell, and given the atmosphere at the time, it was practically impossible to convince the directors that they weren't talking about nukes. And even once I did, they still didn't even think this was worthy of action. I mean, the Redacted would probably have me hanged for treason if they ever find me, but it was worth the risk. And by what I can gather, sounds like Russia thinks so too, loaning you half the Pacific Fleet and all. The interview continued after this point, but the rest of the conversation was considered irrelevant and stricken from the official file. The interview left the Foundation with more questions than answers, though they were more certain than ever that SCP-741 must be kept under strict containment procedures. Due to the object's location at the bottom of the sea, as well as the unusually elevated pressure around it, it is unlikely that many civilians will come into contact with it. However, as an extra protective measure, sonar and submersible monitoring is conducted on a periodic basis in order to verify that the wreckage has not been interfered with in any way. The Foundation contracted Russian warships, SCP-001-UBU and Krasnoyarsk, has been selected for this purpose. If any unauthorized activity occurs in the area surrounding SCP-741, nuclear and conventional missiles may be deployed. Any movement of SCP-741 is grounds for an immediate nuclear strike. Whatever secrets SCP-741 holds, whatever it was transporting that was even more of an uncontrollable threat than nuclear warfare, they're better left alone down there, at the bottom of the sea. Today we're going to be taking a look at one of the odder SCPs in the Foundation's custody. The Foundation has plenty of weird and downright silly anomalies, as we've covered extensively in the past. Plenty of them are objects that you wouldn't imagine need to be under heavy containment, but you'd be wrong. Even innocuous household objects with a harmless albeit annoying anomaly can pose an immense danger to normalcy and human life. So today we're going to be taking a look at SCP-2966, affectionately and nervously referred to by scientists on break and at the water cooler with an odd nickname, the InfiniTP. TP, of course, refers to exactly what you're thinking of: toilet paper. Just based off that nickname, you've probably already gotten a pretty good idea of what this anomaly is, but you'd be surprised. Just because something is predictable doesn't mean it's harmless or easy to contain. SCP-2966 is contained at Outpost 117, a small isolated little facility far, far out in the icy tundras of northern Canada, well away from any other settlements or Foundation sites. It's kept so far away because of any other SCP objects coming into contact with SCP-2966 is incredibly dangerous and prohibited under any circumstances. It's also kept so far away from cities or towns for another reason. Below the ground, Outpost 117 is host to an experimental thorium nuclear reactor. Thorium reactors are highly efficient nuclear reactors, but only a few exist in the entire world for scientists to perform research on. What's one doing under a tiny, out-of-the-way facility in the Canadian wilderness? Well, all nuclear reactors produce a lot of heat and energy, as they're designed to. This reactor is right next to the containment chamber SCP-2966 is locked in, pumping heat into the chamber at incredibly high temperatures. SCP-2966 can only be removed for experimentation, study, or cleaning when enough heat has been pumped into the chamber to heavily reduce how much matter there is. But the SCP Foundation is in the business of containing anomalies, not destroying them like the GOC. Why would they be using nuclear power to slowly and constantly degrade what seems like a fairly innocuous anomaly? Well, clearly, it's not entirely innocuous. Outpost 117 staff is as bare bones as the facility itself. Only a single skeleton crew of 16 people. Just enough to keep the facility and its reactor up and running without risking any casualties. 3 nuclear engineers trained in the upkeep of nuclear reactors, and 4 Foundation researchers to monitor the reactor and SCP-2966 containment chamber. Along with that, there are 8 trained soldiers from the Foundation's MTFs to guard the facility and its perimeter 25 kilometers out from the outpost itself. But that's only 15 people. Who's the 16th? Well, unsurprisingly, it's a D-class subject, to be used for direct experimentation with the anomaly. Considering most SCP sites have personnel counts in the hundreds or even thousands, 16 seems remarkably little. But the Foundation has learned their lesson from past breach events involving SCP-2966. The D-class in the orange jumpsuit has an extremely important job. Every 8 hours, 3 times a day, the D-class is to use SCP-2966. Given what we know the anomaly is, you can imagine what that entails. But whenever it is used, at least 10 sheets of toilet paper have to be removed from it and, well, used. That use is heavily monitored by the research team, and a few of the MTF troopers and radio communication is maintained through the whole gross event. The research team advises the D-class on whether to speed up or slow down the rate at which they tear off paper from SCP-2966. There's other equipment too. A vast array of sensors and scales to measure SCP-2966 mass and density, and the data is fed back to the researchers and into the nuclear reactor's systems. Needless to say, all of this is extremely strange. What could a role of TP, infinite as it may be, possibly do to warrant a dedicated research team and nuclear reactor? Not to mention regular use experiments and constant monitoring of its data points. Whatever it is dangerous. The Foundation is currently constructing a runway for jet aircraft just outside of Outpost 117, so that personnel can evacuate should something go critical. Not the nuclear reactor, but SCP-2966. Clearly, whatever it can do, it is more worrisome than a nuclear reactor going into meltdown. We've got a lot of questions by now, so let's see if we can figure out what exactly SCP-2966 does. Our predictions from the name, however, were entirely accurate. SCP-2966 is an anomalous branded roll of toilet paper. For security reasons, we can't tell you the brand, but we can tell you that it's entirely possible SCP-2966 might have a distant cousin in your own bathroom. The first strange thing about SCP-2966 is its weight. It weighs at least several kilograms, though its weight is usually changing and Foundation personnel are told not to try reducing it, not after the incident. Anyway, it sticks around 5.5 kilograms. You'll notice that it's a lot heavier than you'd expect a toilet paper roll to be, given it's made of, well, paper. Its weight isn't the only unusual thing about it. It's also really good toilet paper, anomalously good even. We won't go into detail because I don't think anyone wants the details on that, but let's just say the best toilet paper you've ever used, SCP-2966, is softer, stronger, better in every way. But once a sheet is ripped out of SCP-2966 roll, it's not anomalous anymore. It can be used and thrown away normally. SCP-2966 itself is attached to the wall inside a metal housing, the kind you'd see in a public bathroom, with no way to remove or replace it. Not that it needs to be replaced. X-rays and ultrasounds of the metal housing are inconclusive, but the Foundation doesn't want to cut into it with saws because, well, you'll see. Not to mention the fact that the metal housing is the main way the reactor's heat is funneled into SCP-2966, and playing with nuclear power is a little risky. But what's actually anomalous about SCP-2966? Well, it's an infinite roll of toilet paper, but we knew that already. Since SCP-2966 was contained, at least 10 kilometers of toilet paper have been pulled from it, over 6 miles. The research team hasn't seen any evidence of it absorbing mass or producing new toilet paper, and testing has revealed it's not pulling the paper from an alternate dimension or reality. Despite all the testing, the researchers are baffled by how exactly SCP-2966 keeps producing the toilet paper that it does. But even if they don't understand how it happens, they have gained a pretty good understanding of what the results are. And the results are a lot less fun than you might think. See, SCP-2966 still obeys the first law of thermodynamics. Matter and energy can't be created or destroyed, only change forms. So SCP-2966 doesn't actually create toilet paper so much as it absorbs energy from its surroundings, then transforms that energy into matter, more specifically, toilet paper. How exactly it absorbs energy is unclear to the Foundation, but they've run the math. One sheet of SCP-2966 weighs approximately 3 grams, which means that approximately 2.04 times 10 to the 16th joules of energy, or roughly 65 tons of TNT, is needed for one sheet of SCP-2966 to be produced. From there, they were able to extrapolate that SCP-2966 contains at least several thousand sheets within the roll, an extremely large amount of explosive power, all contained in a roll of toilet paper. Now you get why SCP-2966 is so dangerous. It's not just a roll of toilet paper. In the wrong hands, it could be one of the most powerful explosives ever detonated, easily able to wipe out half a country. But if you think that's where SCP-2966 danger really lies, think again. Removing SCP-2966 sheets is harmless until you remove 10 of them at a time. Then it'll start absorbing the energy around it, at roughly the rate that the sheets are removed. It's trying to rapidly gain energy to rebuild itself, and it'll get the energy from anything. It's usually in the form of heat energy, but it will absorb anything, even sound. But when there's no active source of power, SCP-2966 becomes dangerous. It starts sucking up energy from the ambient heat around it, and given the large amount of energy, it sucks up fast. In only a few minutes, it can bring the temperature of the room it's in to absolute zero, completely stopping all molecular activity. This has happened twice when the power went out at Outpost 117. Both times the casualties were high. Research personnel sacrificed themselves to run into SCP-2966 chamber and start ripping sheets away from it, bringing the temperature down. They all died from hypothermia, but they saved the entire site and stopped SCP-2966 from going critical. You see, when SCP-2966 isn't used for a while, it starts to decay. The matter it's gained in the form of toilet paper is reduced back into pure energy, radiation. Thankfully, it's not ionizing radiation, the kind you'd find in a nuclear bomb. It's simple heat and alpha radiation, mostly harmless if you're equipped right. After extensive testing and more than a little trial and error, the researchers figured out the perfect distance between using SCP-2966 after letting it absorb energy and letting it decay into radiation: 8 hours. That's why the D-Class has to use SCP-2966 every 8 hours, because if it goes over, something very bad happens. SCP-2966 decays matter and energy exponentially, and gets faster and faster the longer it's left untouched. Within a day and a half, SCP-2966 goes critical, at which point the rate of energy radiation gets so high that it starts rapidly getting close to infinity. Sounds like a lot of complicated physics, right? So let's bring it down to terms all of us will understand. When the rate of energy decay becomes infinite, what happens is that SCP-2966's entire mass is converted into energy in a single moment. All that energy stockpile is released in one gigantic, titanic explosion. Remember how we mentioned that SCP-2966 could feasibly be used as a bomb? Yeah, this is that bomb exploding. The explosion would result in at least 1,000 megatons of TNT. For comparison, the Tsar Bomba, the Soviet mother of all bombs, had a yield of about 50 megatons. Needless to say, SCP-2966 going critical and exploding would very likely be an XK-class doomsday event. Aside from blowing up half of Canada, it would cause wildfires, tsunamis, and easily blanket the sky in ash and soot, choking out plant life. And that's all aside from the massive human casualties. The Foundation has long since realized that even though Outpost 117 is out of the way, SCP-2966 going off would be much, much more than even they could handle. Thus, the containment procedures currently in place. Keep SCP-2966 right in the sweet spot so that it doesn't need to absorb energy from people, but make sure it doesn't get enough energy that it decides today is a great day to extinguish human life as we know it. When SCP-2966 was being used by the D-Class, they noticed something a little odd. The D-Class, from the toilet on their radios, reported that the room temperature of the containment chamber seemed to drop a little. The researchers aren't quite sure of what this means yet, but the D-Class also reported that the paper removed from SCP-2966 is exceptionally comfortable, strong, and effective as toilet paper. A handful of the researchers submitted a proposal to remove sheets of toilet paper from SCP-2966 and re-roll them to send to other Foundation facilities. But due to the risk and possibility of accidentally creating another SCP-2966, the Council denied it out of hand. So now we've got a much better understanding of what the heck SCP-2966 is, and how a little roll of toilet paper could pose such a massive, overwhelming threat to not just the Foundation, but all human life, and why the containment procedures are as extensive and thought out as they are. The research teams at Outpost 117 are hard at work performing additional research on SCP-2966, but there are still big questions. Most importantly, how was this thing created? Who created it? And how did the Foundation get a hold of it and learn what it could do without accidentally detonating it? Well, SCP-2966 was discovered after global weather satellites noticed the temperature dropping in a small part of the Canadian wilderness. The Foundation, being tapped into the Global Information Network, also noticed and realized the temperature drop was anomalous. Agents in the area confirmed that something strange was going on, and Mobile Task Force Theta-19, the Rocketeers, found a small research facility named Pine Range Research out in the backwoods. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was how it was completely frozen over for an entire square kilometer, despite it being a warm summer day. The MTF measured the temperature, then rechecked it 3 more times to ensure they hadn't gone insane. The temperature was negative 108 degrees Celsius. For comparison, the coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth was negative 90 degrees Celsius. The research team are now able to say that the only reason everything wasn't at absolute zero was because the breach had happened hours ago, and the sun had time to warm everything up a little. The Mobile Task Force breached into the building and found a scene of devastation. All individuals in the building had been killed from hypothermia and exposure. As they went further in, they encountered a lecture hall, with one researcher giving a lecture to others holding SCP-2966. Because SCP-2966 had completely frozen everything, all the electronics in the building were corrupted, and the Foundation couldn't get any useful data. But the MTF did discover a handwritten journal by the researcher in one of the offices, and was able to recover small sections of text after thawing it. The journal was a small diary of research notes and daily happenings from the researcher. It detailed how the Pine Range Research Company had achieved a huge breakthrough in toilet paper technology. Their new, highly effective toilet paper formula was somehow infinite. The company had been experimenting with anomalies. They planned to monetize the product, and even expand into other paper products. But a few weeks later, the researcher detailed how the project had hit what he called a minor setback. They weren't able to produce cellulose fibers making up the paper fast enough to make the roll truly infinite. It would eventually run out before restocking itself. But he had a solution in mind, though it was rare and expensive, using a halved isotope of the element hafnium, known as quaternium. Though the Foundation hasn't been able to find any other evidence of such an element, the researcher admitted that he was a botanist, not a physicist or chemist, but he was perfectly capable of understanding the research papers written by his colleagues on the matter. He claimed that in this day and age, anyone with a doctorate should be able to understand others' work, if they wrote it clearly enough. He was dead set on figuring out a way to make his project work. And work it did. The very next entry detailed how a metallic housing of the toilet paper was complete. The initial roll of toilet paper had been added in, and soon the quaternium alloy would be complete, for insertion into something called the hyperbaric containment field. They were still running into issues here and there, particularly on the matter of the radiation that it was constantly emitting, but the researcher was confident that they wouldn't hamper the rest of the design. Unfortunately, from the frost damage, the remainder of that entry was rendered illegible. Another entry the Foundation was able to recover from the journal was dated to the day before they encountered the temperature drop in the Canadian interior. The researcher wrote about how the energy required for the production of radiation and from it, the toilet paper, was higher than he expected it to be from his calculations, but he wasn't worried, and planned to rework the calculations slightly differently. He didn't have time to walk it back for more extensive testing and modeling, since the first test of the prototype was tomorrow. From what the entry read, he was excited that the world would never again need toilet paper. The rest of that page was filled with equations, only some of which the Foundation were able to decipher. But the Foundation mathematicians discovered what went wrong when they solved the equations by themselves. The researcher had made a very simple error early on when calculating E equals mc squared, which led to his entire work being thrown off and coming to a conclusion that the energy output wouldn't nearly be as high. Of course, the researcher was tragically and fatally incorrect. His desire to save the world from toilet paper shortages might have been prescient, given current events, but his lack of care and patience led to the deaths of him and all of his co-workers, and the creation of SCP-2966. The Foundation moved in and suppressed the event with a cover story of a burst liquid nitrogen tank, and amnestics were disseminated to any local witnesses. Since the Foundation couldn't safely move SCP-2966, they chose to convert Pine Range research to Outpost 117 and contain it where it was. But SCP-2966's story isn't quite done yet. Remember how I mentioned that Foundation personnel aren't allowed to try reducing SCP-2966's weight since the incident? Well, a few months after SCP-2966 was contained, an experiment was performed to see if SCP-2966's mass could be reduced if they pumped it full of energy while rapidly removing sheets. But SCP-2966 immediately went critical and exploded, albeit with a much lower yield than if it had been fully energized. Outpost 117 was completely destroyed, and all the staff were killed, though no civilians were harmed. But in the smoking crater, SCP-2966 was recovered unharmed and significantly lighter. Though the Foundation has rebuilt Outpost 117 and recontained SCP-2966, they've learned that simply letting it explode by itself is not a solution. This toilet paper just won't quit.
It was a beautiful September day, but Sean Taylor was trapped in his car in one of the worst cases of gridlock he had ever seen. He tried to look on the bright side though, and while he was stuck in an unmoving car, at least he had a pleasant view of the wide, shimmering lake just off the road next to him. He was admiring the scene when tiny drops of rain started landing on his windshield. That's funny. There wasn't a cloud in the sky a moment ago. There was something off about the rain though. It looked dirty, a rusty red color. Was that blood? He didn't have time to think about it, because just then a thick, dense mist began to roll over the lake. A fog of blood. Just off the side of the road, he could see a huge silhouette rising out of the water. Is that an old submarine? What Sean didn't know was that he was about to have an encounter with SCP-1861, also known as the HMS Wintersheimer, a ghostly submarine with strange and terrifying effects.
Sean and the other drivers stuck in traffic that day were far from the first people to have a dangerous brush with this legendary vessel. According to SCP Foundation records, the HMS Wintersheimer has been appearing since as early as 1916. The first recorded incident occurred in the British seaside town of Innsmouth-on-Sea. You won't find this town on any maps or in the history books, and you're about to find out why. The 500 population of the town, which had already reduced by the wartime draft into the currently raging Great World War, awoke to red skies on February 6, 1916. Citizens left their homes to investigate, only to find their entire town had been enveloped in a thick red mist. The swelling crimson clouds up ahead began to rain, showering the town in a hail of viscous red goop. Anyone unlucky enough to taste it would say that this strange rain was a dreadful mix of salt and copper. This was because, as the Foundation would later determine, the rain and fog was a disgusting combination of salt water, human blood, and human cerebrospinal fluid. But the real threat was rising just beyond the beach. Technically speaking, the HMS Wintersheimer vessel is designated as SCP-1861-A. It appears to be a World War I era British B-class submarine, designed by Vickers for the Royal Navy in 1904. By 1916, this particular type of boat was already on its way to being obsolete, and were largely deployed in Malta, far from the active fronts. So one of these vessels appearing on an otherwise unremarkable stretch of English coastline should have been a clue that something was terribly wrong. But the poor residents of Innsmouth-on-Sea didn't know the half of it. Soon, figures in what appeared to be archaic diving gear began emerging from the Wintersheimer and made their way into the township. They seemed terrified, running up to and frantically screaming at any local they could find. "Please listen to me. Something terrible is about to happen here. We need you to come with us or you're all going to die. You must believe us." The locals were frightened by what they heard. They'd been listening to news reports of the Great War unfolding across the globe for 2 years now. Had it finally come to them? They pictured shells raining down from the sky, decimating their defenseless little town in a rain of fire. The Navy must have been brought in to save them before the German bombardment began. While some took more convincing than others, the men in diving suits, known as SCP-1861-B, eventually managed to persuade the entire town to join them and lead the townspeople down to the water. One by one, they were all boarded onto the submarine, hundreds of them. Many couldn't believe their eyes as they watched scores of people disappear in front of them into the dark bowels of the Wintersheimer. Where were they all going? How would they all fit in there? But it was too late for any of them to back out now. The vessel submerged once more, and everyone was gone. The entire population of Innsmouth-on-Sea had disappeared in a rain of fog and blood, never to be seen again. The Foundation wiped all records of the town from existence and delivered appropriate amnestic treatment to anyone who still mentioned or remembered Innsmouth-on-Sea. The fate of those who board the HMS Wintersheimer is always the same: vanish from the face of the earth, explained away by the Foundation as accidental death by extreme weather event. There have been hundreds of documented sightings of SCP-1861, and the anomalous weather event can occur near any body of water wide enough to accommodate SCP-1861-A's comms tower and topmost platform. Depth does not seem to be any hindrance of the submarine appearing, and it can even manifest in water that's just a few inches deep. As Sean and the other unfortunate victims of the rush hour traffic were being showered in thick red droplets from above, a crimson mist rolled in between the cars. Sean had heard of so-called freak weather events before, like raining frogs and fish, but this was something different, and it frightened him. He could see now that the silhouette rising from the lake really was an old submarine, and he watched as a legion of mysterious figures disembarked from the vessel and began spilling onto the road. The men in ancient-looking diving suits walked among the cars, and one of them approached Sean's car. He began tapping frantically on the window, and Sean could tell he was yelling something. Sean was scared and more, but more than anything else, he was confused. Against his better judgment, he rolled down the window just a crack to hear what the man was saying. His British accented voice muted by the diving suit, the man frantically told him, "Sir, please listen to me. I'm Lieutenant Samuel Ramsey of the HMS Wintersheimer. We're evacuating the area. Please, you've got to come with me. We're in danger out here." HMS? Sean thought.
Isn't that what they call British ships? What was a British submarine doing in the middle of a lake in the United States?
Through his windshield, Sean could already see other men in diving suits leading people from the cars out towards the submarine. Something had to be going on here, something big. Lieutenant Ramsey was still banging away at the glass of Sean's window, becoming increasingly agitated.
Sir, if you won't comply with my orders, I'm within my rights to take you by force for your own safety.
Sean could feel the fear setting in, but he didn't know what else to do. He turned off the car and took off his seatbelt. He was just about to open the door when there was a tap on the passenger side window of his car. It was a soldier in what looked to be advanced tactical gear. There were several soldiers directing cars to drive on the shoulder to get around the mess of stopped automobiles. Sean looked to his left, and the man in the diving suit was gone. The soldier tapped again, and Sean didn't need to be told twice. He followed his directions and drove around the traffic jam and out of the mist. A half-mile down the road, Sean was stopped by another group of soldiers and given an amnestic. He drove away, never knowing how close he had come to vanishing in the bowels of SCP-1861-A. Sean was lucky that one of the SCP Foundation's mobile task forces had taken over the situation, but they were too late to help those who had already complied with SCP-1861-B's orders and boarded the Wintersheimer. The task force made it their business to save whoever they could, but that wasn't their only directive. The Foundation had recorded a huge number of SCP-1861 instances since 1916, and now they were finally going to figure out what was going on inside. The Foundation had already discovered that those taken onto the Wintersheimer don't simply disappear. Once on board the submarine, they are forced into a diving suit of their own, which transforms them into new instances of SCP-1861-B. Upon realizing this, Foundation scientists devised an ingenious plot. 6 months before this latest instance of 1861, the Foundation dispatched 2 members of D-Class personnel who were familiar with one another into the Red Mist. One was instructed not to interact with SCP-1861-B, while the other, named Sal, was ordered to enter the submarine. His mission was to report back all findings to Foundation researcher Dr. Clutch during the next 1861 event. The D-Class who remained on shore was brought in once more by the Mobile Task Force during the September event that Sean witnessed. They checked each diving suit wearing Anomaly until they heard a familiar voice, muffled by the mask. It was Sal, and he'd been transformed into an instance of SCP-1861-B. The human D-Class, receiving questions from Dr. Clutch via remote broadcast, commenced the interview of his former friend. It is from this vital interview that much of the Foundation's knowledge of the mysterious HMS Wintersheimer is drawn. According to Sal, the interior of the Wintersheimer, which is a long, narrow passageway, is a spatial anomaly that seems to stretch on forever. This explains how vast number of people, like the entire population of Innsmouth-on-Sea, can disappear into the submarine at once. Sal reported that, about an hour after entering the vessel, the hatch closed and the interior began rapidly filling with water as the submarine descended. Prisoners of the Wintersheimer were faced with 2 choices: suit up or drown. Few chose the latter option, and as soon as the suit was on, the transformation had begun. As soon as everyone was suited up and the submarine had fully descended, causing the 1861 weather event to dissipate on Earth, the Wintersheimer had effectively entered an alternate dimension. The airlock opened, and the new recruits were instructed to step outside and take a look around. The Wintersheimer veterans informed the new sailors that everyone on land was likely already dead by this point. When Sal first exited the submarine, he commented on everything around him looking eerily similar to how it looked on land before the mist descended, but with one key difference. It seemed as though everything was underwater. Well, not quite that. It was almost as though everything was water, like the world had taken on a kind of flowing liquid state. Sal and the others existed in this otherworldly land of living water for 6 months, and as the months passed, things only got stranger. They found that they neither needed to eat nor sleep. According to Sal, all they did was breathe, and pass the time by exploring and talking to one another. Anyone who attempted to take off their suit would dissolve and diffuse into the same liquid that surrounded them. Dr. Clutch asked Sal about the other inhabitants of this alien realm, and this was when things got truly disturbing. There were dead humans and animals floating all over the place, missing their eyes as though they'd been scooped out, and missing their mouths, as though they'd been bitten out of their face by some kind of huge predator. Their empty eye sockets bled constantly, and Sal theorized that this may have something to do with the anomalous blood mists of SCP-1861. When asked to provide more information on why all the corpses were mutilated in this way, Sal said that one of his superiors on the Wintersheimer told him, "The watcher of eyes and biter of teeth deemed them worthy." Whatever this mysterious being was, it seemed to be a powerful figure within 1861's water world, and Sal felt lucky that he never had a direct run-in with the creature himself. For his final request, Dr. Clutch asked Sal to attempt to remove his suit. The Foundation had learned in previous instances of 1861 that the diving suits have anomalous durability, and it was impossible for anyone other than the wearer to remove them. Hence why the Foundation could never deal with 1861-B by using brute force. Naturally, Clutch was interested in finding out what was going on underneath. Sal expressed fear and anxiety at first, wondering if after all he'd been through, whether he could ever be considered human anymore. Eventually, he was convinced to remove the suit, and his worst fears were confirmed. The second Sal removed his helmet, gallons of seawater poured out, and the now empty suit collapsed to the ground. Sal's body was never found. Only some teeth and a pair of eyes were recovered. The eyes were later confirmed to be belonging to a young girl, and the teeth were identified as having come from a European red deer. And so, the dark mystery of the HMS Wintersheimer continues. Because of the unpredictable nature of its appearances and the resulting difficulty of containing it, the Wintersheimer has earned a Keter classification. The only containment procedure currently employed by the SCP Foundation is for mobile task forces to try and intercept the submarine when appearances are reported, and hopefully prevent or at least reduce the kidnapping of civilians. With so many questions left unanswered, all we can say for certain is that if a red mist ever descends on you, and a stranger in a diving suit tells you you're in grave danger, he's absolutely right.
It seems today that all you see are D-class and jumpsuits and contained SCPs. But where are those good old-fashioned explanations on which we used to rely? Luckily, there's SCP Explained. Luckily, there's a channel who positively can talk all about those objects that make us scream and cry.
Anyway, today we're going to be looking at
What frickin' sweet SCP, Lois?
audience. So put on your best pair of green pants and a white button-up, and watch out for any roaming giant chickens. Because today we're going to be taking a look at one of the strangest anomalies in the Foundation's history, SCP-5981, otherwise known as Nuke City. It's just another ordinary day in your average suburban home, where you live with a bumbling idiot of a father, a caring though slightly aloof mother, a sister who seems to be blamed for everything that goes wrong around here, a baby brother who you suspect is secretly a highly intelligent evil genius bent on world domination, and your talking dog, whose sentience you have never once questioned. Okay, this might not resemble your life exactly, but it is definitely just another average day in your life. You hear the front door ring, and you rush to answer it. Opening the door, you see that it's none other than Matt, your friend who is absolutely obsessed with Family Guy, the animated adult sitcom about the Griffin family, whose combination of wacky antics, pop culture references, and irreverent comedic stylings is just about the funniest thing in the world to Matt, who's standing right there in a Stewie Griffin t-shirt. You're pretty sure Matt's the biggest Family Guy guy in the world, and while you think that the show is slightly amusing, you kind of admire his unhinged fanaticism over it. He's seen every episode multiple times, owns all of the home media releases, and even has a multitude of Family Guy collector's pieces and memorabilia, including a mint-in-box action figure of Peter Griffin signed by the show's creator, Seth MacFarlane. If anyone's been keeping Family Guy on the air for the past 15 years, it's definitely Matt. And because he's at your house right now, that could only mean one thing: a new Family Guy premiere. That's right. Ever since Matt decided he loved Family Guy above all else, it would also meant he felt it was necessary to make every single episode airing as they first aired. If Matt was standing outside your door, it meant that he wanted to watch a new episode of Family Guy with you, like you two usually did together every week. While a part of you didn't understand Matt's obsession, you still enjoyed the show, and more importantly, spending quality time together with your friend.
Hey, Peter,
He says in his best Joe Swanson imitation. You roll your eyes as he waltzes into your house without any further explanation. Matt, excited as ever, walks into your living room and plops himself down onto the couch. As usual, he explains that a brand new episode of Family Guy is about to air in an hour, and he was wondering if you wanted to watch it with him. Well, it's not like he's ever given you a choice, you think. You say the same thing you always do. Sure, Matt, you always know what my answer to that question is. As if Matt expected any other response from you, he becomes all giddy and excited. Oh, Matt, you strange, strange human being. An hour later, the episode begins. That Broadway-style intro kicks in, and you find yourself wanting more and more to kick back and relax with Peter and the gang. But something is off. It's not uncomfortable to watch or anything, but all the while, you get the feeling that this episode of Family Guy is somehow different than all the others you've seen. The plot sounds like something out of a dream, even for a show as strange as Family Guy. In the episode, Brian Griffin, the family's talking dog, begins dating a woman who he discovers has fish-like gills on her body. She claims that she's a mutant, and her body has been altered as a result of exposure to nuclear energy in her hometown, a place she calls Nuke City. In spite of the woman's appearance, Brian continues to see her over a series of dates. Peter Griffin, however, becomes obsessed with the idea of Nuke City, having never heard of it before, and finding the concept of a town in constant nuclear fallout, populated by mutated civilians, to be exceptionally exciting, and he pushes Brian to stay with the girl. Over time, Brian and the rest of the cast go to visit his girlfriend and her family in Nuke City itself, which is depicted as a half-destroyed town full of strange, wacky mutants. Peter loves it so much that, in true Family Guy fashion, he decides to break out in song, singing a musical number about how much he loves Nuke City and how everyone should visit the place, and even offers detailed directions on how to go there. As the plot progresses, the Griffins, who are eating dinner at the mutant woman's house, discover that their youngest son, the evil talking baby known as Stewie, has disappeared. Unable to find him, Brian begins to look a bit deeper into the issue and discovers that his girlfriend's father, for unknown reasons, has kidnapped Stewie and is currently located at the town's nuclear power plant. Brian's mind immediately jumps to the worst-case scenario, which is that Stewie Griffin was kidnapped in order to be exploited for his high intelligence and world-ending inventions. Brian rushes over to the power plant with the rest of the family in tow, wondering how and why he would abandon his date in the middle of their meal. At the power plant, Brian faces off against the kidnapper, his date's father. After a lengthy explanation of needing Stewie to manufacture a giant nuclear explosion that would turn the entire world into mutants, a fight between Brian and the mutant breaks out. Thankfully, the dog wins and pushes his date's father to his death as he falls into the nuclear reactor. This triggers a meltdown and a consequential explosion, which the Griffins narrowly manage to escape in the episode's final scene. Brian is thankful Stewie is safe, but laments the loss of his girlfriend. The ending joke, however, is that the explosion caused the residents of Nuke City to mutate even further, with Brian's girlfriend stepping in front of the camera, slightly out of view as a gigantic sludge monster, who asks the dog for a goodbye kiss. When the episode finishes, you're generally surprised. What a strange, great piece of entertainment. Matt absolutely loved it and leaps from the couch over to your desktop computer and immediately starts searching for guided tours of Nuke City. But for some reason, this doesn't strike you as odd. Of course Matt wants to visit Nuke City. You do too. The episode was practically a glorified advertisement for how cool the place is, with all of those mutants walking around and the sweet feeling of nuclear radiation permeating the air and getting into your pores. You wouldn't want to visit anywhere else over the summer, so you sit down to start looking as well. There's not much you can find on the internet about the place, but there is a link that seems to be the hub for all things Nuke City. A website titled, well, visitnukecity.com. The page looks incredibly high effort, with all sorts of quality photos of Nuke City and its freakish residents. It even offered guided tours and a shop with tons of Nuke City merch for you to purchase. But most importantly, it has directions on how to reach Nuke City, and they just happen to line up with the directions that Peter Griffin himself had given in the show. As it turned out, Nuke City was strangely close to where you and Matt lived. In fact, it was located just off the interstate. You could go visit any time you wanted, and that's exactly what you were going to do. A few days later, you packed your bags for an extended stay and hit the road following the directions to a T. Though unsure why, a part of you felt like it was all a dream and that you weren't actually going to find Nuke City. But that couldn't be. It had to be real. There was a Family Guy episode about it, and that website, and more importantly, you and Matt both knew that it was real. Fortunately, those fears were quelled as soon as you entered the city limits and gazed upon the town's greatness for yourself. There it was, Nuke City, looking just as dilapidated and grimy as it did in the episode, with its red, smog-filled sky and its broken-down buildings that were all modified into tacky tourist shops and attractions. It was perfect, and you couldn't be happier. All over the town were the mutated civilians, with their discolored skin and cartoon-like features that made radiation poisoning look like a fun condition to have. They seemed to be enjoying themselves even, guiding tours, operating shops, generally having a great time living in their slightly post-apocalyptic society. Over the next few days, you and Matt lived it up in Nuke City, enjoying the strange food and sightseeing the freaky landmarks, such as a giant tower of human skeletal remains, or the mutated consciousness blob that lived in what used to be a public pool. You were even encouraged to feed the thing and toss some graham crackers from over the balcony. Overall, you felt like you had a great time in Nuke City, and the episode itself couldn't even compare to how fun the actual place was. You experienced things in those few days you'd never experience elsewhere, such as the Nuke Slides water park, or winning it big in Nuke City's many themed casinos. You even brought a few pieces of irradiated rubble for your family to enjoy as souvenirs. It was an unforgettable experience, and you plan to go back someday, at least if you got out of the situation you currently found yourself in, with your entire home being ransacked by black-suited agents and armed guards. That's right. Only a few days after you had returned from Nuke City, you woke up to the sound of banging on your front door, and before you knew it, your house was being raided by what you assumed was the US government, though you weren't exactly sure why. After being transported to an unknown location and sitting down in a strange-looking room, the suited men started asking you questions, all of which pertained to Nuke City. You explained the entire story, how you and Matt went after seeing the Family Guy episode, and how you didn't see why there was anything strange about going to an ordinary tourist destination like Nuke City. The suited man slides you a digital tablet, showing you overhead security footage of what appeared to be your car, exiting the interstate on the day you traveled to Nuke City. Instead of traveling down the extensive exit, your car trails off into the woods, disappearing. 4 days later, it reappears in the exact same spot, driving back home as if nothing happened. You're shocked. Where was the road to Nuke City? You knew you had gone there. Heck, you even had the merchandise to prove it. You glanced down at your Nuke Slides Water Park t-shirt, pointing it out to the agent. The man got up and left the room, and you could see him discussing something with a lab coat-wearing woman outside of the room. When they come back in, it's with a syringe filled with a strange-looking orange liquid. The man tells you there's no such place as Nuke City, and you have no recollection of going there. For whatever reason, his suggestion seems strangely appealing, and the way he keeps repeating those words keeps you entranced. When you least expect it, the woman inserts the syringe into your back. You fall over, slamming your head into the table. When you wake up, you have no memory of anything that happened over the past week. You remember watching Family Guy with Matt, though you can't remember what the episode was about for the life of you. And you remember having a completely ordinary, almost boring week after that. You never think of Nuke City, or that episode of Family Guy, ever again. So, what happened here? Well, you, and just about every other person in the country who watched Family Guy that week, were subject to an anomaly the SCP Foundation has designated as SCP-5981. SCP-5981 is a curious case indeed, as the anomaly itself isn't the episode that aired, but the concept of Nuke City, a fictional US city located at the intersection of Route 93 and 93 Alternate. The city's fictionalized history claims that it was founded in the early 1940s, but was subject to a nuclear strike in 1966. The attacking party varies between accounts, with some saying it was Cuba or the Soviet Union, or even an accidental nuclear detonation by US military personnel, a broken arrow. A very small percentage of accounts of SCP-5981 claimed that it was the Davite Empire, the ancient anomalous society that had disappeared centuries ago, who had launched the strike. Whatever the case, the story goes that after the fallout, most of the city's inhabitants not only survived the attack, but became mutated in ways inconsistent with the reality of radiation poisoning, sprouting extra limbs, organs, gills, in a beneficial way, instead of a lethal one. Now you might be thinking that SCP-5981 is a memetic agent, and anyone exposed to Nuke City will believe that it's a real place, but that just isn't the case. Most subjects exposed to SCP-5981 do not believe that Nuke City exists, and no future consequences will occur. It just so happens that you and your friend Matt were particularly unlucky and fell consequence to SCP-5981's poorly understood side effect, which causes those exposed to Nuke City to not question it and fully believe that the city exists. Those who do so and attempt to visit the city will disappear from reality shortly after entering SCP-5981's city limits. Once they leave, they'll reappear in reality with fully formed memories of visiting Nuke City, and possibly even some paraphernalia related to the city, such as t-shirts with the slogan, "I survived Nuke City," vials of nuclear byproducts, photos and postcards, negotiable US currency won in Nuke City's casinos, or personalized rubble intended to function as a souvenir. Of course, those who return from Nuke City are entirely safe, despite supposedly having visited a place with as high a nuclear radiation count as SCP-5981. Those who visit the area the town is supposedly located in who are unaware of Nuke City will instead find nothing but an abandoned Department of Transportation building, leaving the city's existence accessible only to those who know of it and fully believe in it. The Foundation first became aware of SCP-5981 Nuke City after the aforementioned episode of Family Guy aired on television, labeled Season 13, Episode 7. Within a day, the website visitnukecity.com appeared, and according to Foundation estimates, over 200,000 civilians visited SCP-5981 before the Foundation caught on that this phenomenon was anomalous. After this, containment procedures were established, with the road leading to the city being closed off, and a web crawler being programmed to remove any mention of Nuke City from the internet. Anyone the Foundation could track down as having visited Nuke City, like you and Matt, were paid a visit by Foundation agents, interrogated, and anesthetized. But most importantly, the Foundation made sure to see what was happening behind the scenes at Fox Studios, who produced Family Guy at the time. Seth MacFarlane, the executive producer and creator of Family Guy, was given a stern talking to by Foundation agents, but even then his interview offered very little understanding of how SCP-5981 originated or why the episode was even produced. The Foundation forced him to produce a statement that said that SCP-5981 was not real and was simply an element of fiction that the writers had made up for the show. After this, the Foundation removed the episode from public distribution, and after 3 months, way after the hype surrounding Nuke City had passed, a complete and total information blackout on the episode was put into place, essentially wiping this episode of Family Guy from the minds of the general public through the use of mass amnesticization tactics. Unlike those with MacFarlane, interviews with the cast and crew of Family Guy revealed that they believed that SCP-5981 was entirely real, and that the episode would shine light on a lesser-known tourist destination. While MacFarlane claimed that he had just came up with the concept for the show, while under hypnosis, the man revealed that he had been approached by an individual wearing all-black robes and a cone-shaped hood prior to the episode's conception. This entity instructed MacFarlane to produce an episode revolving around a nuclear town, where, in its climax, a resident would be murdered by being pushed into a nuclear reactor. MacFarlane could not recall anything else about this memory when brought back from hypnosis. Still, the Foundation continued to monitor for incidents revolving around SCP-5981. While still some tried to visit the city, these events were far and few between. A few notable events include a civilian who did not return from SCP-5981, but whose family was sent a letter from Nuke City Hospital explaining that they had been killed in a motorcycle accident while touring the city. Another involved a heavily injured civilian returning from SCP-5981 after an altercation with a street gang. Their blood revealed traces of irradiated nuclear radiation, yet no ill effects aside from those received in the street gang beatdown were noted. Another incident involved the television channel Cartoon Network, receiving a tape containing an entire season of a cartoon revolving around 3 mutated dogs and their lives, which was being pitched by Radioactive Studios, a company supposedly located inside SCP-5981. The final incident involved several US politicians visiting SCP-5981 and accidentally being caught in an explosion that occurred as a result of a janitor pushing a plant worker inside a nuclear reactor in the city's main power plant. Much like what occurred in the episode, this resulted in an explosion that destroyed a massive portion of SCP-5981. The Foundation could do nothing but cover up the politicians' deaths and increase security outside of SCP-5981's entrance. The case of SCP-5981 is certainly mysterious and gives very little answers, but it's definitely one of the most unique anomalies that the Foundation has had to deal with. Keeping true to the spirit of Family Guy, let's end with a cutaway gag.
On May 12, 2588, the entity known as SCP-UBU manifested in Kangastak, Greenland, like something out of the most nightmarish kaiju movie never made. Soon after, there was no more death, but the world was filled with such chaos and despair that humanity longed for that eternal release. From its enormous stomping feet to its cloaca to its face, featureless save for a gaping, grinning, devouring mouth, the entity was pure malice with all the time in the world. UBU decimated the planet, breaking the spirit of mankind and razing every city to the ground. In the earlier days of UBU's invasion, when there was still dry land and people still wanted to talk to each other rather than joining floating islands of eternal chemically induced slumber, they would commiserate about the shared misery of the state of things. "Oh, UBU? My daughter hasn't spoken to me ever since that monster shoved my whole body down her throat," someone would say. Another would pipe up, trying to one-up the first man in sort of a trauma Olympics. "Didn't you see me in the news? UBU carried me around for a week, snacking on me every now and then like I was his own personal turkey leg. It was hell. But honestly, part of me felt a little bummed out when he threw me away." Yet another person would chime in, like veterans swapping war stories over a drink at the bar. "UBU made me eat a pair of my pants, whole thing, zipper and all. Then he decided he thought that was funny, made me eat pair after pair after pair of them, rinse and repeat. By the time he got bored, I'd eaten probably around 20 pairs. I sort of got a taste for them after that." Everyone on the planet had good reason to despise SCP-UBU, but no one held more hate in his heart for the pale, wicked creature than Dr. Lawrence McHowd. Before the world was turned upside down, sometimes literally, Dr. McHowd was a member of the mysterious O5 Council at the SCP Foundation. To be specific, he was O5-11. But that prestigious position at the Foundation couldn't protect him or his loved ones from the wrath of UBU. When Dr. McHowd was off duty, UBU attacked him and his wife. First, it impaled his wife on a broom handle. Next, it threw Dr. McHowd into an open pool of sewage in the street. Then, it bathed him in the filthy water, using his screaming wife as a scrubbing brush, all the while whistling a horrible little bathtub song. Centuries after that awful experience, as Dr. McHowd watched most of his colleagues give up and choose the closest thing to death in this broken world, he became even more determined to do something about it. On January 14, 3030, Dr. McHowd abandoned the SCPS Naismith and his fellow O5 Council members in search of the SCPS Corncrake, an abandoned craft to the southeast. It wasn't an easy journey, rowing all the way there in a lifeboat, never knowing when the great white beast would emerge from the water and choose him as its next unfortunate plaything. He could see the SCPS Corncrake still floating there, untouched. But before he could row any closer, something collided with the lifeboat from below, snapping it in half. Dr. McHowd's stomach dropped at the sight of pale flesh, but it was soon replaced with relief when he saw that the thing that had broken his lifeboat was not, in fact, UBU. It was an injured narwhal, behaving erratically due to its wounds. The culprit was almost certainly UBU. It wasn't content to just torment humans.
but instead must have been targeting any life form that could feel pain and fear. In his own words, Dr. McCloud had put it, "At least a mass extinction wouldn't have made it that personal." After the lifeboat broke apart, McCloud swam to the conrake, exhaustion and cold straining his muscles. It took him 2 hours to reach the abandoned cargo barge and containment site, but eventually he managed to climb up over the side and get on board. There was one very special thing about the corncrake, the thing that made it worth crossing the ocean in a fragile little lifeboat to find. Every anomaly that made the Ganymede list, the list of anomalies considered too dangerous to abandon, even in an apocalyptic scenario, was contained on the corncrake. If there was anything left that the Foundation, or anyone else, hadn't tried to use to defeat UBU, it would be on that ship. After taking a little while to recover, Dr. McCloud embarked on an initial exploration of the craft. All the staff were gone, as he had expected. Thankfully, he still had his O5 ID card, and it still worked like a charm, unlocking all of the automated security systems on board. A lot of what he found was in ruins, but some things had survived. He found 10 hominid replicators from SCP-2000 in perfect working order. There was a cage containing the remains of SCP-2845, the deer, though UBU had done significant damage to it. SCP-319, a curious device, was there, contained in the space-locked vacuum chamber. This one was notable for its potential ability to destroy the universe. He found a couple of safe-class anomalies, such as SCP-YEZ, crowd control for the Practical Optimist, and SCP-FNA, the Portable Warehouse. The latter of the two was a portable door frame to a pocket dimension. He also stumbled upon SCP-001, Last Ride of the Day, an old Prometheus Labs prototype of a time machine. And possibly, most importantly, he found SCP-076. The coffin was open, but Abel didn't attack Dr. McCloud. He wasn't consumed with murderous rage and bloodlust, the way he always was before. Instead, he was just sitting on the edge of the ship, silently staring at the sea. When he spotted McCloud, he gave him a small wave and did nothing else. The centuries of a world without death, a world without killing, without victory in battle, had taken its toll on him. For possibly the first time in his eternal life, Abel was depressed. 9 days after he first inspected the corncrake, McCloud began to formulate a plan. He loaded all of the hominid receptors into SCP-FNA, using a thankfully still working forklift. Next, he was able to unseal the sealed portion of SCP-001, Last Ride of the Day, and get his hands on the details of the anomaly. It read, SCP-001 is capable of temporarily relocating to its relative position 15,000 years prior to activation. This temporal displacement is divergent paradox irrelevant. In other words, a separate timeline is created as a landing point. For example, if an occupant from timeline X were to murder their parents in utero in timeline Y, the Y iteration of the occupant would no longer exist, but the occupant themselves, being from X, would be unharmed. When in a fully active state, SCP-001 deploys a 5-meter-high telescopic antenna that functions as a Coloco wave energy sink. Essentially, Coloco waves could only be produced as a byproduct of the universe suddenly being exterminated, and ZK-class reality failures produce the most Coloco waves. In one of these scenarios, SCP-001 would be able to use these waves to go back in time 15,000 years, effectively resetting reality to a point far before the catastrophe happened. This information allowed him to put his plan together, to resurrect Project Beluga. Step 1. Plant explosive charges around SCP-319. Step 2. Hide anything potentially useful against SCP-UBU inside of SCP-FNA. Step 3. Get into the cockpit with SCP-FNA in tow. Step 4. Raise the Coloco sink. And Step 5. Blow the whole thing up. 3 days later, it was time to put the plan into motion. Dr. McCloud placed the charges around SCP-319's vacuum chamber. There was enough in place to implode the walls of the vacuum chamber. He closed the bulkhead and began deploying the Coloco sink. 10%, 25%, 30%. Suddenly, he could hear a loud crashing sound. The ship began to tilt. Oh no. He could hear the distant sound of menacing giggles. The sink reached 45, 57, but as UBU grew closer, he quickly overrode the system to lower the sink. 45%, 30%, 25%, 10%. UBU grew closer and closer, and as it approached, it began to whistle the tune it once used when it bathed Nuked and his wife in the sewer. UBU began to pound against the blast door, becoming increasingly frustrated as it struggled to break through. Suddenly, another voice cut through the air, an unexpected one. SCP-076 Abel called out to Nuked, encouraging him to carry on while Abel held the beast back. As Abel and UBU engaged in an epic battle, Nuked suddenly remembered something. There was an express deployment module for the Colicos sink. With no time to waste, he activated it. All at once, he hit the detonator, and then, the year was 11,970, and the date was February 14th. 13,963 years later, the SCP Foundation discovered something beneath a mound of earth and snow near the northern border of Lapland, Finland. It was a shipping container with a reinforced exterior, the interior of which could only be accessed through a fortified bulkhead on one side. The words SCP-001 were written on the side in black paint. In spite of this, the object was given the designation SCP-8048. A narrow, winding tunnel through the mound of earth and snow was discovered, leading from the door to the outside world. The tunnel had significant wear, clearly having been used as a footpath by someone. But who? Well, on April 12, 1993, the Foundation got their answer. SCP-8048's bulkhead opened, and a man stepped out, snapping his fingers and promptly sealing the door behind him. He was designated Pol 8048. He was a 32-year-old man of French-Canadian descent, answering to the name of Dr. Lawrence Nuked. He made a series of claims that the Foundation found dubious, but noted it in the official file for SCP-8048 just the same. These included, but were not limited to, SCP-8048 is a time machine. He held the office of 05-11 in the year 3030 from an alternate timeline. Said timeline experienced a modified Omega-K class end-of-death scenario that coincided with the invasion of a Tiamat-class anomaly known as SCP-UBU. SCP-UBU was an extremely dangerous and sadistic entity who was capable of, among other things, neutralizing SCP-169 and SCP-682. His timeline's version of the Foundation launched Project Beluga, which resulted in an impossible war with SCP-UBU that lasted 441 years. Pol 8048 deliberately sabotaged SCP-319 to act as a power source for SCP-8048, thus arriving in Lapland in the year 11,970 BCE. SCP-UBU will arrive in Greenland on May 12, 2588. Pol 8048 was able to extend his lifespan by sharing his consciousness between a central computer within SCP-8048 and several thousand bodies created by his personal hominid replicators. Said consciousness sharing was achieved through a book classified in the future as SCP-YEZ. He wishes to assist the Foundation in the termination of SCP-UBU, and has laid out a plan for its termination as outlined in Document 8048-Zeta. There were, of course, concerns about the man's legitimacy, but after Nuked mentioned over 104 specific terms and data points known only to members of the O5 Council, the Foundation was forced to take him at least a little bit seriously. A motion was filed, requesting that Pol 8048 be allowed to assist the Foundation with the termination of SCP-UBU as per Document 8048-Zeta. O5-4 voted yay, O5-7 abstained, and the rest of the Council voted nay. The motion failed to pass. A follow-up motion was filed in response, requesting that Pol 8048 be allowed to assist the Foundation with their own strategy to respond to SCP-UBU. O5-1, O5-4, O5-7, and O5-10 abstained from voting. The rest voted nay. The motion failed to pass. On April 14, 1995, Dr. Isaiah Henderson and Pol 8048 sat down for an interview. When asked to state his name, Dr. Nuked also recited a mimetic passphrase that, when spoken by anyone other than O5-11 of past or present, would cause them to burst into flames. The two men were at odds from the beginning. Dr. Nuked expressed dismay and frustration that his proposal was rejected. Meanwhile, Dr. Henderson countered with the insistence that Nuked's proposed plan was rejected for posing an unnecessary risk to the civilian public. They debated for a moment, before Dr. Henderson announced the Foundation's next plan of action. Dr. Nuked was to be terminated. The Foundation would proceed with its plans without him. At that point, Dr. Henderson terminated Nuked as ordered. He didn't count on one thing, though. Nuked was no longer an ordinary man. bound to one body. He hopped into the body of a guard, then into the body of 05-4 to deliver a vital message. He had started this plan alone and was ready to bring it to a close alone. Project Beluga would continue with or without the Foundation's support. Dr. McCloud returned to the bulkhead, climbing back inside and sealing it behind him. He had hoped to have the Foundation behind him. He had hoped they would be allies in the fight against the greatest evil mankind ever encountered, but they disappointed him. He had waited thousands of years, only for the organization he devoted his life to try and kill him. Well, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. This was bigger than the Foundation, bigger than anyone, and no living person was as equipped to handle UBU as he was. So he resumed Project Beluga as a one-man operation. He issued a mission statement, which read as follows. On May 12, 2588, the entity known as SCP-UBU invaded and pillaged human civilization for no other motivation than cruelty and selfish gratification. Shortly thereafter, Project Beluga was founded as a joint effort between the Global Occult Coalition and the SCP Foundation for the purposes of UBU's destruction. UBU is not merely a threat to human safety. He is an affront to every positive and loving concept in the human consciousness. Rather than our lives, he seeks to destroy our quality of life to sate his own sick desires. Think about it. The taste of ice cream, playing with your dog, the way you felt after your first kiss. That is UBU's sworn enemy. No fate is too cruel for him. No hatred is strong enough. When Project Beluga's charter was signed, 592 GOC officers and Foundation staff were present at the ceremony. Our troops numbered in the hundreds of thousands. I, Dr. Lawrence Michaud, am the only surviving member, and always will be. What I lack in numbers is compensated thousandfold by my weapons, my mind, my replicated bodies, and eons of experience. The following record serves one purpose alone, that once justice has been brought to UBU, humans in the shining and golden UBU-free future will understand that one person can accomplish through the power of hard science and raw emotion entwined in a perfect and indestructible braid. And while we are at it, you are very welcome. Over the next several hundred years, McCloud worked to secure ownership of Kangastock, Greenland through a Project Beluga civilian front. He evacuated the civilian population from the area, then spent a century constructing a superweapon. With 100 high-yield nuclear weapons, heat amplification runes, a targeting beacon for SCP-DAG, and 5 antimatter gathering pods from SCP-HNM in place, he was finally ready for UBU to manifest again. Everyone has bad dreams, whether they're about unconscious memories, showing up to school in your underwear, or a man in a stripy sweater with a spiky glove and a serious moisturizing problem. Nightmares are never far from us, a common occurrence as part of the human experience, and they can happen to anyone. Of course, working for the SCP Foundation means being faced with actual nightmares, not only in the middle of the night, but on a day-to-day basis. Giant unkillable lizards with pure hatred for humanity, ancient eldritch beings with enough cosmic power to wipe out entire dimensions, and a species of buses with gigantic insect legs that feed on human beings. Needless to say, the researchers and operatives that find themselves employed by the SCP Foundation come face to face with some pretty horrific creatures, enough to give anyone sleepless nights. This naturally begs the question, what could possibly scare the workers of the SCP Foundation? What could the Foundation possibly have nightmares about? Well, they don't really have a name for him, just a designation, SCP-990. Multiple members of Foundation staff have all made reports of witnessing the same entity. After all, when you deal with dangerous cognito hazards for a living, it's worth taking every unusual occurrence seriously, instead of just relying on the old "it's just a dream" excuse. Anyone from doctors and research personnel to mobile task force operatives and those working as anomaly guarding security, every person working for the Foundation is at risk of an unwanted encounter with SCP-990. The reports are all consistent. They all describe a man, seemingly a human being. This figure always seems to appear dressed in a business suit, but not like you might see a modern CEO or a Wall Street stockbroker wearing. Instead, SCP-990's sense of fashion seems to be at least a few decades out, and he seems to favor wearing clothing more in line with the style of the Cold War era. Wait, that can't be it, right? The big bad boogeyman that terrorizes the dreams of the SCP Foundation staff is just a man in a suit? What is he, an IRS agent? Well, while SCP-990 might not be all that scary to look at when compared to other frightening anomalies like the haunting beaked visage of the Plague Doctor, or the unknowable horror that is SCP-096, it's not the way he looks that's terrifying. It is the ominous warnings that he carries with him. What is interesting is that while most dreams are usually our brain's way of processing our memories or real-world experiences and anxieties, SCP-990 seems to have no recorded existence beyond what has been reported by staff. He seems to exclusively exist within the dreams of Foundation personnel, with absolutely none of these people having witnessed or encountered the suit-wearing man in the real world. If there is somewhere out there among the 7 billion people on planet Earth a man who resembles SCP-990, then the Foundation has been unsuccessful in tracking him down. What's more is that there has never been a single report from outside of the Foundation, not one civilian or even any member of another group of interest, that anyone else has ever had a dream involving SCP-990. For years now, he's been cropping up exclusively in the nightmares of Foundation personnel, but was first discovered a number of years ago after several agents began to discuss the fact that they all had experienced similar dreams, all revolving around a mysterious man in a Cold War-era business suit. But then, he finally became known to the higher-ups at the Foundation after one peculiar incident. An agent had failed to report to his assigned post at the right time, and from that moment on, things would never be the same again. After scouring the Foundation facility for this missing agent, when fellow members of personnel found him, he was fast asleep in his quarters. Doesn't seem too unusual, right? After all, working at the SCP Foundation has got to be pretty hard going, with some horrendous overtime hours, so maybe the agent just needed to catch up on some sleep by taking a quick nap before the start of his shift. Then again, 18 whole hours is one hell of a long nap. That's right. The man had been unconscious for 18 hours. When they found him, fellow Foundation staff were unable to awaken the sleeping agent, his body having entered some form of short-term coma. Unsure if he would ever wake again, medical personnel had the agent moved to the sickbay on site, where he was placed under surveillance and continued his long sleep. After almost 2 whole days and an uninterrupted 40-hour period of sustained sleep, the agent finally awoke. He was agitated, erratic. Clearly something had rattled him pretty severely. The agent dashed out of his bed in the medical bay and began frantically running through the corridors of the Foundation facility, screaming and babbling about the impending end of the entire world. Eventually, medics were able to restrain the man, injecting him with powerful sedatives to relax him long enough for them to secure him. Yet somehow the agent's bodily functions remained in a heightened state even after he was sedated. His heart was beating at a dangerously accelerated rate, and his blood pressure was spiking to quite an alarming degree. Now, we may not be medical experts, but we can guarantee that high blood pressure and an elevated heart rate are rarely ever good signs. Then again, neither is being asleep and unable to wake for 40 solid hours. As you may have already guessed, when he finally calmed down, the agent described a dream that revolved around a man dressed in a business suit that seemed to match the styles of the Cold War era. In other words, SCP-990. But you see, it's not like the mysterious man trapped the agent in this 40-hour dream just to torture him. There was no pulling the agent through the center of his mattress, causing a volcanic eruption of blood to splatter up to the ceiling. SCP-990 didn't wrap any bed sheets around the agent's neck, or slash at him using a glove with a blade at the end of each finger. Instead, all SCP-990 did during the course of the agent's dream was deliver a message. Well, actually, it was more of a warning than anything else. After he had awoken and calmed down from his prior outburst, the agent was being evaluated by a Foundation doctor. During this evaluation, the agent was able to describe, in the most acute, precise detail imaginable, a chilling sequence of events. Something that was so accurate that it could only have been true, instead of just an inconsequential dream or a fabricated made-up story. The agent was describing exactly how the world was going to end. Not a single detail was omitted. The exact times and dates, the tipping of every domino on the geopolitical landscape that would ultimately lead to annihilation. SCP-990 had appeared in the agent's dream to describe exactly how, at some point in time, a series of events would culminate in multiple tactical nuclear warheads being launched. These deadly weapons of mass destruction would head straight for targets in Central Europe and Eastern Asia, seeming to imply that the missiles were being launched by the United States of America. The resulting devastation of the nuclear payload would wipe out almost the entirety of the human race, exterminating around 98% of the planet's population. Society would collapse on a global scale, and the world would be rendered a barren, inhospitable wasteland, ravaged by radioactive fallout. Every detail of this impending apocalypse was relayed to the agent by SCP-990, including exactly who and what would trigger the initial chain of events destined to end in total destruction of Earth. Deciding to take the mysterious suited man's message seriously, the SCP Foundation dispatched one of its elite mobile task forces to eliminate that initial threat, removing the thing that would topple the first domino. While the crisis was averted and the world saved, the agent who first reported his encounter with SCP-990 died, suffering symptoms resembling severe shock. Of course, just because you managed to stop one approaching apocalypse doesn't mean that there won't be others. In fact, when you think about it, that's the scariest thing about SCP-990. It's not that he appears in Foundation personnel's dreams, it's that his work is never done. He always brings with him a new warning of a new disaster on the horizon. If anything, the ripples caused by preventing one of these crises only create another to deal with. Since this initial incident, now designated as Event 990-07, SCP-990 has made a number of similarly ominous warnings through the nightmares of other members of the SCP Foundation. Any one of this business suit-wearing omen's warnings come with almost 100% certainty rate. He can foresee the future without any margin of error, successfully predicting the exact dates, times, and causes of the deaths of multiple doctors working for the Foundation. Even the destruction of a noted facility, known as Watch Station Epsilon 38, was foretold by an appearance of SCP-990. Of course, theories about who or what exactly this man is are common, but with no clear, definite answer to speak of. It is currently up in the air if this entity is some sort of guardian angel, helping the SCP Foundation protect humanity from their own downfall and guiding us all to safety. Or he could be a visitor from an infinite number of potential futures, projecting himself back in time to avert whatever course of action led to the end of the world. The staff at the SCP Foundation are encouraged to come forward if they ever have a nocturnal encounter with SCP-990, with one doctor even believing that the man has a physical body somewhere out there in the real world. During one dream with SCP-990 in it, a Foundation doctor was able to conduct a complete interview with the man. Now, we all know that it can be pretty tricky to recall the details of a dream after waking up, but this particular doctor claimed to have an almost impeccable memory. It is unclear how exactly this doctor was able to converse so clearly with SCP-990, but with so many people working for the Foundation, perhaps it was only a matter of time before the man in the suit found one capable of lucid dreaming. After commencement of this dream interview, when asked for his name, SCP-990 responded with Tony, as if he pulled the name from thin air. When the doctor asked if this was his real name, SCP-990 claimed that a person should have the right to be called whatever they wish to be called, before changing his mind and asking to be called Richard instead. The doctor pressed on, asking the man why he had been delivering threats to Foundation personnel through their dreams. SCP-990 seemed confused by this. Then the doctor rebutted by accusing the Dreamwalker of murdering the agent, the one who had first reported his encounter with SCP-990. Hearing this, the entity explained that the Foundation had the wrong impression of him, claiming that he wasn't the bad guy. Upon mention of a bad guy being involved, the doctor's next course of action was naturally to ask who this might be. And then SCP-990 said something even stranger. It was the designation of another SCP, but not one that the Foundation had ever encountered before. There didn't even exist any anomaly under the number that the mysterious Dream Man had given. There is no SCP with that designation, and there won't be for some time, the doctor argued, growing ever more confused and agitated. Well, of course not, SCP-990 replied. She hasn't even been born yet, much less classified by your Foundation. When asked if this was another prediction of an impending disaster, yet another threat that could end the entire world, SCP-990 simply told the doctor, "This is your wake-up call." Since then, no one is certain who or what this future anomaly could be, whether she has since been contained by the Foundation or if that is still yet to come. The sad part about our dreams is that they only ever really offer us a look backwards, memories and experiences all warped in our sleeping brains. None of us can look forward. Nobody knows exactly what the future holds. Well, none of us except SCP-990, that is. It has been a long time since the Foundation designated SCP-990. If that prophesized nightmare of an SCP has been born and designated since then, what do you think she is? Let us know down in the comments.
The helicopter lurched and rumbled as it made its descent through the Verkhoyansk mountain range. Conditions were harsh, with fierce winds ripping through the valleys. At any point, a blizzard threatened to strike. Just about managing to touch down, Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 was glad to be out of the vehicle, even if it meant stepping into knee-deep snow. There were 8 operatives in total. Early reconnaissance suggested that they were the only people present within a 5-kilometer radius, at least. That's certainly what they hoped. L9 operatives 1 through 6 all made their way up through the mountain pass, leaving 7 and 8 guarding the chopper. This was a simple reconnaissance mission. They would need to search the bunker for any signs of life, gather intel, and get out, hopefully before the snowstorm hit. All 8 of them were kitted out with the Foundation's Keter-grade cutting-edge anti-psionic plating. The operatives had all been chosen carefully, with L9-1, the leader, being an experienced soldier, serving 11 years in the unit. He had capable psionic powers himself, and approached L9-2, who showed some of the same gifts. All of a sudden, as the group rounded the final pass and caught sight of the facility, both 1 and 2 experienced severe migraines. Battered by the Russian wind, they had no choice but to get to the bunker as fast as possible. It looked relatively unassuming, a small concrete slab sitting amongst the mountains. The 6 of them gathered around on either side of the doors as Number 3 forced his way inside. Following standard breaching maneuvers, the rest of the team followed suit, charging in through the open doorway and immediately tipping forward into an abyss. They all landed hard side by side on the slope, some of them rolling down, clattering against each other, and eventually skidding to a stop. Very gingerly, the group started to get back to their feet and catch their breath, as the wind had been knocked out of all of them. They weren't in a research facility at all. The Soviet concrete walls they'd been expecting, the old computers and the lab equipment were all missing. Instead, they were standing in a void, infinite and white, with no seeming end in any direction. Beneath their feet and curling up above them was an enormous double helix, a rainbow of colors weaving in and out of one another. It was like they had found themselves standing on an enormous strand of DNA. Floating all around them were glowing orbs of light. None of them could tell how near or far these orbs were. They could have been close enough to reach out and touch, or they could have been on the other side of the universe. And slowly, one by one, they noticed the doorway that they had come in through. It was perpendicular to the double helix and floating about 3 meters above their heads. Through it, they could see the snowy Russian mountains, their only chance of escape. 4 murmured something about needing to leave. 1 argued back at him. They had no idea whether that door was real or an illusion. They had no idea if they would even be able to pass through it. Besides, it was 3 meters above their heads and floating out over the void. It was risky. But 4 didn't care much about receiving permission. Taking a few steps back further down the double helix to get a good run-up, he braced himself and sprinted as fast as he could before jumping and reaching for the open doorway. It was as if gravity was suddenly much stronger. As soon as he stepped off the double helix, 4 was wrenched downwards, tumbling and spinning, accelerating faster and faster. He let out a petrified scream that sent the other operatives cowering. There was no bottom, at least not as far as they could see or hear. 4's body just got smaller and smaller, and his screams quieter and quieter for several minutes until the agents couldn't hear him anymore. And yet inside the heads of 1 and 2, the psionic members of the group, that screaming sound only seemed to grow louder. December 25th, 1962. A man walked briskly through the West Berlin train station. He'd shaved his head the night before and trimmed his beard down to a thick mustache. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes and a fedora was tipped forward. He hoped that his limp was convincing as he shuffled his way through the crowds. One advantage of wearing dark sunglasses in the middle of winter was that he could constantly scan the faces of those around him, looking for anybody who looked Russian. His train had been delayed. An hour outside of Berlin, the train had ground to a halt.
German police officers had walked the length of the carriages, checking everyone's tickets and passports. It felt like an eternity. The man was too old by this point to attempt to run away. Besides, running through rural Germany in the snow didn't sound like the best plan. So he stuck to his cover story and hoped against hope that the fake passport he bought would be convincing enough. Fortunately for him, the officer checked it. He looked to be about 18 years old. The man doubted that the boy would know a Russian passport if it was signed by Nikita Khrushchev himself. But shuffling through the station, his feeling of unease grew. Russian deserters had been poisoned all around him for the prior 15 years. A number of his own colleagues had mysteriously gone missing after feeling disenfranchised by the Soviet agenda. He was such a high-profile target that there was no way the KGB wasn't actively hunting him down at that very moment. He clutched the briefcase tightly and made his way out of the station. His plan had been to call a taxi, but now the prospect of being alone in an anonymous vehicle with only one other person terrified him. His best protection would be to stay out in the open as much as possible. He would walk to the British embassy, or rather, he'd pretend to limp there. Lambda 9 operatives number 7 and 8 stood by the helicopter shivering. Their team had been missing for hours now, and they could see the blizzard slowly covering the mountain range like a blanket. Before long, it would reach them. If their helicopter got buried by anything more than a couple of inches, all hopes of evacuating back to base would be dashed. As soon as their team had gone through the doors into the facility, all radio contact with them had been cut off. The Foundation had suspected that the bunker would be heavily insulated, but if that were the case, surely one of them would have stepped outside to resume radio contact and report what they had found so far. Then, all of a sudden, 7 went limp. He remained standing, but his head and shoulders slumped forward as if he'd fallen asleep. Perhaps he had been standing out here for too long. 8 was about to rouse him when suddenly 7 started talking. "Hello? 8, can you hear me? It's 1, are you there?" The conversation moved quickly. Somehow 1 had been able to reach out to 7's mind and temporarily take control in order to use him as a mouthpiece to communicate with the Foundation over the radio. This kind of contact would normally have been well beyond what 1 would have been capable of, but he explained that as soon as they had entered the facility, both he and 2 had felt their powers growing immeasurably. The Foundation asked for a situation report, and 1 updated them about what had happened to 4. Trying to escape through the door, he jumped and fell through the abyss. But what was more sickening was that they had seen 4 again. All of a sudden, they had started to hear his screams physically, not psionically, and he had fallen past them just off to their right, almost within touching distance. Having decided that it was too risky to attempt an escape as 4 had done, the group of them made the decision to travel further down into the facility, descending along the helix. For the next 3 hours, 7 is unresponsive. He stands there limp in the snow, hunched forward and not speaking, despite 8 and the Foundation's best attempts to wake him. "Command, we found something. The helix branches off a bit. There's a doorway there. I can see inside. It looks like a lab of some kind. We can walk to it. Hopefully it's a way out." Command sent authorization for them to proceed, and so they did. 1 reported that it appeared that they were back in the real world. The abstract shapes and colors, the infinite void was gone. They were in a Soviet research lab. There was medical equipment everywhere, syringes and jars full of, well, maybe it's best not to know what was in them. As Lambda 9 walked through the facility, checking every corner before rounding out, they felt a profound sense of unease. Surely enough, that feeling was warranted. Rounding the corner, 1 found some human remains. The man appeared to have been a researcher at one point. His brains were now stretched out and stuck to the walls like silly putty. What the hell happened here? Safely on British soil, the man who had defected from the Soviet Union sat in the interview room, chewing his bottom lip. He had spent so much time focusing on how he would escape with his life that he hadn't spared much thought for what he would say once he was on the other side. They had codenamed him Iceman, but he didn't feel particularly cold at that moment. He felt nervous, but he did his best to hide it. "I was a project manager in the Psychotronics division of the main intelligence directorate. I oversaw Project Redline, which was commissioned by Joseph Stalin following the Second World War. And before he knew what he was doing, he told his interviewer everything. Over 20 million Soviets had died during the Second World War. Their death toll eclipsed that of any other country. Iceman had witnessed it all. So when Stalin had come to him with the task of creating an ultra-powerful psychic weapon, something that could convert the entire world population to adopt Marxism-Leninism, the man had his reservations. Activating a device like that could trigger a war even deadlier than either of the two already experienced that century. He was part of GRU Division P, the Russian arm of highly classified experimental research. Conferring with his team, they devised a plan. They would argue they needed absolute secrecy to carry out their work, even away from the watching eyes of the KGB. Rather than create a weapon, they would create a tool for peace. Instead of promoting the values of communism, they would create a psychic tool to dampen humanity's inclination towards violence and aggression. Their method would be brutal but a necessary evil. In short, their theory was the psychic mind is often limited by the human body. A young child could have incredible psychic potential, but their physical limitations would hold them back from exercising it. Therefore, they needed to separate mind from body, and they had just the trick for that: traumatic disassociation. They would take a young, gifted psychic and tear out their mind in order to transfer that mind into the body of a controllable avatar. Iceman explained that none of them could have expected how much fate would look favorably on them. Just 2 years prior, the KGB had captured and brought in a set of triplets for them. The triplets were incredibly rare, conjoined at both the head and the torso, with 3 arms and 6 legs. It was a miracle they were still alive, so Iceman and his team set to work immediately. They dosed the triplets up with as many mind-altering chemicals as they could physically endure, before electrocuting them for prolonged periods, whilst reading anti-violent manifestos to them. It worked. The triplets' minds disassociated, and the Soviets were able to capture it. Iceman was not forthcoming about what they did with the mind or where they transferred it. All he explained was that it worked. They took the weapon to the Norlag Gulag. 50,000 of the most vicious criminals known to man, looters, murderers, psychopaths, dropped their makeshift knives and refused to move an inch, even as we threw the gates of the camp wide open. We did that. The final test was on Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. From thousands of kilometers away, they activated Project Redline and influenced the 2 world leaders at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. War was averted, but Khrushchev was furious. He removed the entire team, killing a number of them, and began to weaponize Project Redline. If they could fire it at an advancing army, they'd never lose a single soldier ever again. To do this, it needed to be stronger. They were to implant the consciousness into another subject, torture them further, and disassociate again, amplifying the psychic abilities. Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 were stuck in the facility. The blizzard had been so strong that 7 and 8 had to return to base the previous night and come back. Having spent a night lost and wandering through the helix, descending deeper and deeper, the team had noticed that the world around them was getting darker. Periodically, they could hear Force screaming and falling past them once again before dropping out of sight again beneath them. They had tried to catch him, to pull him back, but he was always just out of reach, desperate to be saved. 7 and 8 returned, and their psychic puppet radio contact was resumed with command. The team found another door. Searching through it, they were horrified to find their own corpses floating in the air in front of them, dressed up in lab coats. Just like the scientists from the levels above them, their brains were stretching out and lying together in some kind of web. Yet further down the helix, they found another door. 1 and 3 decided to go inside, leaving the rest of the team standing on the helix, ready to catch 4 if he fell past again. This time, 2 was in contact with command through his psychic link to the men by the chopper. He soon reported hearing 4's screams getting closer and closer. The group stood around, ready to catch him. There he is. I can see him. He's definitely falling towards us. Yeah, I see it too. Command? There's something up with 4. It looks like he's spread-eagled. His arms are stretched out. He's screaming. It's not getting louder. It's getting flatter. There would be no further contact with 2, 5, and 6. By the time 1 and 3 returned from scouting out the room, they were alone. 1 couldn't even sense the presence of any of their squad mates anymore. They had no option but to continue to descend the helix into the darkness. The smell of burning flesh filled their noses. The echoes of death were all around them. Voices cried out in pain and fear. And then, new voices, speaking in Russian, cut over the top.
Stop it. Give in. Don't resist. Resisting is bad. You will be punished if you resist. Begin electrical discharge, 500 volts, 3 amps. Increase voltage every minute.
The operatives had no choice but to listen to the memory of the triplets being tortured. Not just the sounds, but the emotions that flood them. Those weren't someone else's memories anymore. They were becoming their own. And just as they saw into the mind of the triplets saw them in return.
Command, it's trying to open me up, like it did everyone else, but I can see into it. It's learning from us. It knows all about me. The squad, the Foundation, they're almost on me. It's the Conjunction, the scientists, the monsters that made this thing. The ones it knew before it died was that they wanted it to conjunct. It wants to make us part of it. Don't come back here. It wants to make the whole world part of it.
And at that moment, the entirety of Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 dropped dead. In that same moment, a multicolored sphere of energy 5 kilometers wide appeared over the facility, dwarfing the mountains around it, designated SCP-2664-A. For years, the Foundation dropped psionically dampening materials and psionically stumped D-Class personnel into the sphere in hopes of slowing its growth. No other containment measures could be acted upon. That was until 1300 hours on the 25th of December 2000, Christmas Day. SCP-2664-A suddenly fluctuated, releasing an enormous amount of psionic energy that resulted in the brain death of all humans within a 200-kilometer radius. The following day, at 1700 hours, a global occult coalition satellite launched a spherical payload right into the heart of SCP-2664-A. For 13 minutes, tremendous amounts of radiation were detected emanating from inside the sphere, before just as suddenly as it had appeared, SCP-2664-A disappeared entirely, leaving just the payload in its place. Before the Foundation was able to recover the payload, it launched into the atmosphere and was lost. Subsequent reconnaissance operations to the site have confirmed no abnormal radioactive or psionic readings. To all intents and purposes, SCP-2664 appears to be gone. As such, the file has been marked as neutralized. Long may it stay that way. A war to end all wars. Deaths in the billions. Two dueling ideologies, dancing humanity to its ultimate swan song. And could it all start in a bathtub? A grainy photo of an art installation, printed in an otherwise ordinary edition of a local paper. It was seemingly so unremarkable that the fact it was lost to history was almost expected. The paper didn't circulate wider than a small town. The photo wasn't seen by many, and the art installation itself hardly saw any visitors. But to researcher Armitage, it had become an obsession. While his colleagues were busy chasing reports of an anomalous pair of shoes that could cause human combustion, Armitage was perusing through archived newspaper clippings, trying to find the worn black and white photo. Why? It was because he had been there. The installation had taken place in his hometown. He could remember seeing it with his own eyes, and what happened when he sat in the water. His recounting of the incident to his superiors at the Foundation had been met with skepticism and dismissal. Despite walking them through his vivid memory of what happened that day, the senior research team had shrugged it off, telling him that there was no way he remembered it right, despite it feeling so clear to researcher Armitage that it could have taken place only the day before. He could recall the voices, the details of their conversation, and even a few specific key phrases, and the fact that he'd only heard them when he interacted with the art installation. But the senior team dismissed it, saying that he must have just overheard the politically charged conversations of some other people in attendance, despite Armitage's claims that the area around him had been silent when he heard those voices. Hours of pleading gave way to days of waiting for approval for the investigation to launch. When a letter of denial was left in Armitage's pigeonhole, his refusal to accept the senior team's decision led to weeks of angry back-and-forth emails, followed by months of secretively conducting his own covert investigation, trying to grasp at as many straws as he could find, gathering what few scraps of evidence still existed. He was sure the thing he'd seen was an anomaly. He just needed proof. Any moment he wasn't searching, he was recounting the day it had happened in his head. People in his hometown had been murmuring about a strange stage that had been set up seemingly overnight with a bathtub on it. Nobody had been awake to spot who had left it there or why. But overhearing a few local residents gossiping about it, calling the whole thing a weird piece of modern art, was enough to pique the interest of a young Hank S. Armitage, years before he'd eventually joined the ranks of the SCP Foundation. Making his way across town to the park where this unusual bathtub supposedly was, Hank spotted a small crowd that had gathered around it. It was mostly just noisy townsfolk, coming in to see what all the fuss was about, or maybe investigating on the chance of finding something mildly interesting in the otherwise boring place where they all lived. As he drew nearer, craning his neck over some of the crowd taller than him, Hank spotted the stage that he'd heard described. Sure enough, there was the bathtub too, a freestanding ceramic one. In fact, it looked similar to the one his grandmother had owned, a fairly commonplace kind that was sold in the United States between the 30s and 60s. Seeing one only a decade out of that time frame was hardly a rarity. But there was something that had been left out of the description Hank had eavesdropped on. A sign on a simple stand, with a phrase printed on it in plain lettering. The sign read, "The Debating Tub." There was no other information, nothing else to placate the crowd, whose curiosity was already starting to dwindle. Some stayed, expectantly watching the stage, waiting to see if something might happen. Others gave up early and started drifting away, figuring they had better things to do. After all, it was a Saturday. MASH would be on soon, unless those leaving were from a Happy Days household. No matter how many filed away, Hank Armitage stayed. He'd convinced himself that the moment he stepped away would wind up being the moment where all would be revealed about this strange art installation. He tried to derive some kind of meaning from it in the meantime. Maybe there would be a cash prize like on Jeopardy if he could figure out what this strange oddity was meant to represent. Was the tub empty or full? Did an empty bathtub represent the emptiness of certain debates? Was it an indictment of a philosophy that the artist had disagreed with? But how could Hank even guess if he didn't know who the artist behind it was? Racking his brain was starting to hurt his head. Surely it meant something. By now, there was hardly anyone else around, and a thought crept into Hank Armitage's head. Curiosity was getting the better of him, so he headed towards the stage and hopped up to investigate further. Water. The tub was full after all. He ran his fingers across the surface, then retracted them when he felt just how icy cold it was. The hurried motion of his hand splashed some of the water out of the bathtub, and instantly, Hank's heart raced. Normally, he wouldn't react to something so mundane, but he caught himself looking around, just in case an enraged artist suddenly emerged from the shadows to yell at him for messing with his masterpiece. Nobody seemed to notice. Even the few passers-by enjoying a drink on their Saturday night didn't pay him much mind. That was when Hank noticed something. He thought his eyes might be playing tricks on him, so he braved another touch of the freezing water, scooping up a handful and letting it drop outside the tub. Then he did it again, and again a third time. He hadn't been seeing things. The water level wasn't going down. Examining the tub closer, Armitage looked for pipes or maybe even some of those PVC tubes some folks had. There was nothing feeding more water into the bathtub. It was a neat trick, Hank thought to himself. However, the artist had pulled it off, a self-refilling bathtub. But it didn't answer any of his burning questions. What did the debating tub mean? Why go to all this trouble to set up an art installation like this, and why do it in a small town of all places? A passing gaggle of drunks yelled something as they staggered home through the park, something about telling Hank he should take a bath. But as their laughter faded into the distance, it gave Hank another idea. The debating tub. Was the goal of the piece to get people to have a debate in the bathtub? Not quite believing that he was really about to do what he was considering, Armitage slipped off his shoes and carefully climbed over the edge of the tub. The water was still freezing, and felt even worse as his clothes were soaked through. Shivering at the cold so much that his teeth were chattering, he sat down in the bathtub. And that was when he heard them. Two voices, both men. They sounded so clear and close that Hank had to look around, wondering if it was another passerby. He searched inside the bathtub itself, looking for anywhere it could be coming from. A speaker in the plug hole? No, nothing there. Yet he could hear two distinct voices, one that was clearly an American, the other speaking in what sounded like a thick Russian accent. They were arguing, barking things back and forth at each other, and while Hank Armitage tried his best to pay attention and pick up on their words, picking up the odd mentions of names he recognized, Brezhnev, Castro, Kennedy, Khrushchev, but he was shaking too much, hearing the sound of his own teeth and shaky, panting breaths drowning out the bickering voices. Trying in vain to keep himself warm in the icy water, before long Armitage could not take it anymore and hurriedly pulled himself out of the tub. The moment he stepped trembling out of the water, the arguing had stopped. His feet and fingers were numb, the rest of his body being chilled by the cold night air. He could get back in again, but that might mean giving himself hypothermia. He would come back tomorrow, he told himself, as he rushed back in the direction of his home. Bring a towel and some dry clothes to change into. Then he would be able to fully listen to what the voices in the bathtub had said. He never got his chance, falling ill with the flu thanks to the cold water. By the time Hank Armitage had recovered, the art installation of the debating tub seemed to have disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. All those questions as to who had left it there, or why, or what it all meant, were lost to the young man. These were the same questions that both spurred his interest in the anomalous and continued to plague him for the rest of his adult life. Getting nowhere with his research, an older Armitage tried changing up his approach. He knew there was a thriving, mostly underground trade in anomalous art. He began digging into some of the groups of interest that were usually the culprits of buying, selling, and creating these unconventional pieces. Maybe one of them had heard of the debating tub before, possibly even seen it as an installation somewhere else. He trawled through databanks for hours, perhaps even days, until he found something. A report seized from an anomalous auction that the Foundation's agents had infiltrated, with a heavily redacted list of the sold lots. It was listed as an antique bathtub, circa 1930s through 1960s, with a capacity of over 140 liters. Never needs refilling. That had to be the same tub, seemingly so unremarkable by anomalous standards that it had been overlooked as just an ordinary antique. Searching further, researcher Armitage was able to find his next crucial piece of information: the name of the buyer. While it wasn't clear exactly how the anomalous bathtub had wound up in the hands of one Jacob Ali Alden and her roommate Finnegan, although Alden was recorded to have been the one to acquire it at auction, the identity of the seller remained unknown. Ali would later come to regret the purchase of the debating tub, however. Pulling some strings and passing an anonymous tip through the chain of command, Armitage was able to have SCP Foundation agents conduct a covert raid of Alden and Finnegan's home. There, agents unearthed some interesting findings that seemed to at least shed some light on why Ali and Finnegan were originally so interested in the anomalous bathtub. Although the pair resembled ordinary civilians, the duo seemed to be interested in the creation of anomalous artwork, and judging from the evidence present in their home, had already made several attempts to produce their own. They possessed a collection of small moving statues, paintings capable of basic speech, and CDs containing recordings of music that could actively alter people's moods. In addition, the Foundation agents searching the premises discovered indications that both Ali and Finnegan may have been frequent visitors to the Wanderer's library, an almost endless extra-dimensional library said to contain a catalog of all known information across multiple universes. Only accessible through specific dimensional doorways, time is known to pass differently in the Wanderer's library, providing some explanation as to why Alden and Finnegan were absent from their home during the Foundation's raid, and why it was deemed a poor use of Foundation time to wait for the pair of anomalous art enthusiasts to return. But the debating tub was there, and that's all researcher Armitage cared about. The bath was recovered by the Foundation and brought in for examination, with Hank Armitage able to leverage what he referred to as the negligence of the senior research team into once again getting to take a closer look at the newly designated SCP-1974. Upon closer inspection, it was learned that SCP-1974 was capable of refilling itself at a rate equivalent to the rate at which it was being drained, able to maintain a constant volume of 124 liters of water, about 24 liters short of being full. Any other substance added to the water would be filtered out and then extracted through anomalous means. But the most interesting thing to the obsessed researcher Armitage was the two voices constantly arguing within the tub. Both were only perceivable when a person made contact with the water inside SCP-1974. The American voice was referred to as SCP-1974-1, described as sounding male and around 85 years old. The second, SCP-1974, was also believed to be male, with a heavy Russian accent, and seemingly around the same age. The American voice claimed to be the bathtub itself, while the Russian voice claimed to be the water, and each displayed a clear dislike of the other through their constant debating. The subject of their arguments would perpetually revolve around the differences between the ideologies of communism and capitalism, as well as the historical and current-day status of the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. Given which side each voice argued in favor of, SCP-1974 quickly earned the nickname of the Debating Tub and Communist Water. Despite insisting that he get to once again sit in the tub and communicate directly with the two voices, researcher Armitage was subsequently denied any further access to SCP-1974. This came after it was learned that he had used blackmail in order to orchestrate the Foundation raid that led to SCP-1974's discovery, leading to a reprimand and replacement by a different lead researcher. The newly appointed Dr. Hull was granted permission to conduct an interview with both SCP-1974-1 and SCP-1974-2 in order to determine what their exact origin was. Upon Dr. Hull sitting in the water, the two voices were already mid-argument, with the American voice, SCP-1974-1, stating that, in a hypothetical scenario where the Cuban Missile Crisis was never resolved, Russia would have never won an all-out nuclear war against the United States. The voice even blamed the differences between Russian and American education for the other voice possessing opposing viewpoints. Then, SCP-1974-2 refuted that claim and asserted that the children of the USSR were statistically better at science, meaning, according to the Russian voice, they could have won a war against the egotistical USA. This argument continued in an inane back and forth, with Dr. Hull struggling to get a question into either of the anomalous voices all the while. SCP-1974-2 argued that communism would return to power, while the United States was too busy staring at its muscles in the mirror. SCP-1974-1 denied this, stating that communism would never escape the all-encompassing reach of capitalism. When Dr. Hull was able to cut through the bickering and ask about the origins of SCP-1974, the Russian voice of the water explained that an unnamed American scientist had been able to turn a Soviet prisoner of war into a tub of anomalous water. Then, the scientist's next experiment resulted in him turning himself into a bathtub, leaving both of them stuck together as SCP-1974. Then, both voices subsequently began berating Dr. Hull, encouraging him to leave the bathtub. Funniest thing we've ever seen. The eye-searing flash crested over the horizon. It was the only thing Greaves remembered seeing before shielding his eyes from the blast as quickly as he could. Looking directly at it would have blinded him. The low rumble of the impact shook the ground in the distance, drowning out the frightened, desperate wails of the sirens, a warning that nobody could do anything to heed. An initial shockwave started rippling outwards from where the bomb had hit. Over in the city, windows were shattering, buildings were falling, everything was burning. Greaves turned heel and sprinted back towards the entrance, ignoring all the screams and abuse being hurled at him from the civilians blocked out by the barricades. One called him a murderer. He had to shut it out despite the guilt gnawing at him. In seconds, the shockwave from the blast would reach them, clouds of radioactive fallout sweeping over all the people still so desperately trying to break down the fences that kept them from getting inside the Ikea. Once his foot had crossed through the entrance, the automatic doors slid closed. Someone slammed down the shutters, and with a metallic thud, the cries and the chaos were left outside. The agent stared for a moment at the only exit, the only way back to a home that was now being ravaged by nuclear fire. Everyone and everything he'd ever known was gone, yet the mission had to carry on. The migration wasn't just necessary, it was vital. After taking a moment, Greaves nodded to the rest of his squad, signaling that it was time to move out. They fell into a defensive formation around the mobile containment unit, weapons at the ready, and began to make their way deeper into the infinite Ikea.
Verkhoyansk Ska Republic in the Russian Federation.
The rumor was that that's where it all had started. It made sense, after all. That was where the Foundation kept the Dead Hand, protected by the combined might of two mobile task forces that stood guarding SCP-1984, Omega-59 and Sigma-18, Nechayeva's Wolves and the Chess Masters. The Foundation never confirmed who had been responsible for launching the attack against the complex. Most fingers pointed towards the Chaos Insurgency, or GRU Division P, although no one could seem to come up with a cognate reason as to why the Russian government's own anomalous containment organization would make a play like this. Mutually assured destruction seemed to be the only explanation, and as far as excuses for ending the world go, it was a flimsy one, to say the least. Whoever those mercenaries were, or rather whoever they'd been working for, they were certainly efficient. They hadn't started with an all-out strike against the Foundation armed containment complex that housed SCP-1984. After all, facing off against both the task forces stationed there would have been quite the short-lived fight. In fact, their attack had started months earlier, in a far stealthier way than the Foundation ever could have predicted. But before we go into the terrifying way the mercenaries attacked, I have a question for you. Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Regardless if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in this world who is going through a hard time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, and this is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/SCP Explained. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/SCP Explained. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. And now back to the secret mercenaries and their insane attack strategy. The powers behind this mercenary group must have figured out that part of SCP-1984, the corpse of a Russian sergeant, Marat Cherinkov, could detect and monitor radio waves, scouring broadcasts for any information relating to global military tensions and the possibility of threats to the Russian Federation, as well as any other former parts of the Soviet Union. Using this knowledge, the mercenary group had been subtly feeding SCP-1984 information via radio broadcasts that had gone undetected by the Foundation. Their on-site information control team normally kept the Dead Hand in its dormant state by transmitting radio and TV broadcasts to imply there were still ongoing tensions between the Soviet Union and NATO that were gradually easing. SCP-1984 believing the world remained stuck in a perpetual Cold War. That is, until someone told it the truth, slipping secretive radio messages in underneath the information control team's broadcasts, allowing the Dead Hand to realize the Foundation had been lying to it. When SCP-1984-01 manifested as a hazy apparition that resembled a floating human nervous system, it began decimating personnel sent in to stop it as it raced towards nearby nuclear installations. But it wasn't acting alone. The mercenary forces who had orchestrated the Dead Hand's activation, and whoever their mysterious benefactors were, had arranged for backup to arrive in the area. The same morning that SCP-1984 was primed to activate, a file was sent out to everyone working at the Foundation complex, a file that contained images of SCP-096. This led to an instant containment breach as the Shy Guy appeared at the complex and began viciously attacking the members of the two mobile task forces on site, preventing them from stopping SCP-1984-01. Mercenary forces, equipped with scramble optic technology, also engaged in a firefight with Nechaeva's wolves and the Chessmasters, but the Foundation's operatives struggled to contain both loose anomalies and attacking soldiers of fortune. During the chaos, the Dead Hand was able to reach a strategic rocket installation situated 81 kilometers northwest of the armed containment complex. There, SCP-1984 began interfacing with the base's command systems, authorizing a strike of R-36M intercontinental ballistic missiles to launch at several targets across Europe and the United States. These particular missiles each carrying a 20-megaton nuclear warhead. There was a rumor that upon seeing the first of the R-36Ms crest over the horizon, the commanding officer of Mobile Task Force Omega-59 dropped his weapon to the ground and walked directly towards SCP-096, looking the Shy Guy directly in the face. Greaves and his squad had set up camp in what appeared to be a canteen inside the Infinite Ikea. They'd each brought enough rations to survive for a few days, but the migration protocol had required them to all become familiar with Incident 3008-1 beforehand. They'd been made to study speculative maps based on journal entries from the few civilians who escaped SCP-3008. That same information had been used to chart a course through the labyrinth of showrooms, model kitchens, and flat-pack furniture towards their destination. Establishing a base camp near the canteen had been Graves' idea. They knew that the food restocked each time SCP-3008's crude day and night cycle passed, so they'd have plenty to feed the squad with before they set off once the lights came back on. A few meters away, Greaves spotted an SCP-3008-02 instance lumbering around, lazily shuffling its feet at the tips of its elongated legs, dragging its long arms like it was bored. It did not notice the camp, instead murmuring, "The store is now closed. Please exit the building," to nobody but itself. One of the squad was having trouble sleeping. Patterson had been sobbing quietly, trying to keep himself together. Greaves quietly watched as the man looked at a photo of his family, a husband and 2 kids. It was heartbreaking. They'd been on the other side, outside, left behind with the rest of the world. They all knew that was the plan, of course, and there had been a way to get back everyone they lost once they made it to where they were going. The Foundation had promised them a second chance at life. Even though the world had just been destroyed by nuclear war, they'd be loyal pioneers helping humanity survive. They just had to make it through the Infinite Ikea alive, and then this whole nightmare would end. Once it seemed like the Dead Hand couldn't be stopped and that it would imminently trigger a nuclear strike, the Foundation had to act not only radically, but fast. They knew the risk for potential fallout, both geopolitically and radioactively, was massive. Multiple ICBM launches coming out of Russia targeting the United States and Europe was hardly going to go without retaliation. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and in order to continue its mission of containing anomalies, the Foundation found its hand being forced. Where they had once operated under a veil of secrecy that prevented the public from having any knowledge about their operations, the SCPs they had in containment, even the existence of anomalies as a whole, the Foundation now had one option remaining: going public. The decision came as a shock to many personnel, all gathered around the TVs in various Foundation site break rooms, watching Dr. Gears issuing a public statement to the entire world. He was telling them everything that the Foundation had been working in secret to contain anomalous entities, creatures, people, places, and objects, while the rest of humanity lived blissfully unaware of the dangers they were in. Before outrage, confusion, and terror had a chance to set in, Gears issued a warning to the world about the impending nuclear strikes, but assured the public that the Foundation had a plan in place to save everyone. Most of the personnel watching had no clue what he was talking about. Of course, clearance levels meant there was still plenty of secrecy within the Foundation itself. To many, it came as no surprise there was some contingency in place to circumvent a potential nuclear war, and personnel readied themselves for directives from their superiors. However, soon came the message from the top to disregard what Dr. Gears had told the world, that instead the Foundation would be downsizing as part of something referred to only as the Migration Protocol. In a short amount of time, orders were being issued to secure and seal in containment units of various anomalies, to prepare them for transportation. Meanwhile, the rest of the outside world fell into a predictable panic, terrified of the nuclear warheads set to come raining down on them, and of just having learned there were monsters on Earth with them. But seemingly still working as smooth as polished clockwork, the Foundation went into overdrive, gathering up the containment units as they were instructed and readying them for the next phase of the plan, which they were assured would be revealed to them in due course. As it turned out, the Foundation's goal wasn't necessarily to save the world from impending doom, but to instead preserve the Foundation itself and its mission by abandoning this reality entirely. Their intention, or so they claimed, was to use SCP-3008 as a nuclear fallout shelter and ferry only Foundation personnel, as well as a few anomalies deemed vital enough, into the infinite Ikea, where they could survive the carnage and emerge safely in another near-identical universe where the world hadn't been destroyed by warheads. It was dastardly even by the Foundation's typical questionable standards, and concern began to spread among personnel. The higher-ups at the SCP Foundation assured them that they'd be able to resume their lives in their new home universe, although those who had families raised valid arguments about how they'd seamlessly integrate into living among alternate versions of their loved ones, especially with the harrowing knowledge that their families were being left behind to burn in atomic fire. The Foundation announced its plan was to administer amnestics to their personnel and any of their alternate universe families so that once the migration through SCP-3008 had been completed, nobody would even remember what had happened. It did not take long for word to get out to the public through an anonymous leaker. Once people learned what the Foundation were planning, there was mass outrage and calls for a wider scale evacuation. Civilians kept an eye on Foundation transports, spreading word via social media that they were moving containment units, and having learned of its location, angry mobs flocked to the entrance of SCP-3008, demanding that they too be let into the infinite Ikea and spared from the incoming nuclear warheads. Mobile task forces were deployed to create barriers and block any unauthorized access to SCP-3008, while the designated transport teams were assigned a containment unit and a route through the infinite Ikea. One Agent Solomon Graves had been part of the closing team to be sent in, right before the first warhead made its inevitable impact. Neither Graves nor any of his men knew what anomaly was inside the containment unit. They were trained not to ask questions, just follow the route, carry out the migration protocol, and they would make it back to their families. Another version of them, at least. Not that they'd even remember the difference afterwards. The sound of gunfire stopped them in their tracks. One of the other teams seemed to be in trouble. Patterson had been frantic, telling Greaves that they needed to go and help the others, but the transport team leader knew that doing so could jeopardize the containment unit they had been protecting. But when Patterson broke away from the group and rushed away to help the other transport team, Greaves was forced to divert everyone off course. When they rounded the corner, they were met with one of SCP-3008's display living rooms turned upside down. Furniture had been wrecked, tipped over, or smashed. Bullet holes riddled surfaces, indicating that someone had been firing wildly at something. The other team was dead. Greaves's instant assumption was that the staff, SCP-3008-02, had caught them, but it was still day inside the Ikea. Every one of the other team was present, lying there dead. Of their bodies strewn around the place, it seemed like no staff had been hit by the panicked gunfire. Greaves took a closer look at the bodies of the other transport team. Gunshots. All of them. Someone had fired on them. He ordered the rest of his squad to secure the fallen team's containment unit so they could transport it alongside theirs and carry on the migration. That was when Greaves saw it. The outer seal of the coffin-shaped unit had been opened, revealing a secondary unit inside. Through the clear glass below, he had been expecting to see an SCP, one of the vital ones the Foundation wanted to transfer to their new home. Instead, laying in suspended animation, Greaves could clearly see a man. One he recognized from the news. Had even read the name in the Foundation files. He'd been a billionaire, even suspected to have connections with Marshall Carter and Dark Limited, the secret group of auctioneers who sold anomalies to only the wealthiest 1%ers in the world. And now here he was in a containment unit, protected by a transport team, being ferried safely away from a world destroyed by nuclear fire, through the infinite Ikea, to a new universe. One where he could continue making more money than one person could ever spend in a lifetime. The Foundation wasn't using SCP-3008 to secure a second chance for humanity. It was an opportunity for the privileged few to keep on turning the same old wheel. One of the other transport teams must have found out the truth and snapped, abandoning their home, thinking they were helping the Foundation, only to learn their real job was allowing the rich and powerful to continue profiting in a new universe. Who wouldn't break? As his team looked to him for answers, orders, anything, the lights above Greaves' head shut off. Night again. The drones of SCP-3008-02 started up again in the distance.
The store is now closed. Please exit the building.
If only they could. 36 hours. The SCP Foundation's digital doomsday clock ticks down as Foundation researchers scramble to salvage the biological functionality of the entity known as SCP-1514-1B. These 36 hours are all the time they have left in the world, and once that time is up, the planet Earth will be bombarded with a shower of deadly orbital lasers from SCP-1514-2 satellites. It will be an apocalyptic XK-class scenario, and it's now only 35 hours away. For those who aren't familiar with the way that the Foundation categorizes K-class scenarios or need to refresh their memory, XK-class describes a scenario in which the human population of the planet is reduced to the point of no return. This could be because the destruction is so sudden and irreversible that no amount of preparation can mitigate it. With regards to the scenario that might occur due to the worst-case outcome of SCP-1514, the XK-class label has been applied to indicate the grave nature of the threat it poses. Like the looming threat of nuclear Armageddon, a danger that SCP-1514 was in some ways conceived to combat, the fallout of the laser systems from the SCP-1514-2 satellites could even go a step beyond depopulation. The raw, unleashed force of the lasers could break the planet at its foundations, resulting in the untimely explosion of the Earth itself. It almost goes without saying, but the SCP Foundation's model of a normal reality is one that includes our home planet's continued existence. Due to the high probability of an XK-class scenario occurring if the device and satellites are not secured, contained, and protected, SCP-1514 has been given the object class designation of Keter. Its composite parts add up to a whole that is on par with the fictional space station of the Death Star from the obscure 70s sci-fi fantasy movie called Blue Harvest. Just getting the movie's title is Star Wars, also known as Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, and it's anything but obscure. A smash hit all-ages adventure that forever changed the face of the Hollywood blockbuster. Alongside Steven Spielberg's Jaws a couple years earlier, Star Wars has become a ubiquitous part of pop culture, even as the intellectual property was passed from its creator George Lucas into the grubby mouse hands of the Disney Corporation. But before these now famous movies blasted off into a franchise, it was a trilogy of films that was completed in the 1980s. During the first term of the Reagan administration, it was no secret that the novelty of Star Wars, along with its super high-tech spaceships and space stations, were what caused the United States Department of Defense to invoke its name when referring to the Strategic Defense Initiative. President Reagan announced the beginning of the Star Wars program on March 23, 1983, stating that the United States would soon be able to surpass the current pinnacle of military technology, intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles. Being a man of the silver screen himself, former actor Ronald Reagan began a desperate journey to ensure that this secret service of the air could combat America's international squadron of enemies and prevent the impending murder in the air by studying new technology and weapons night unto night so that the American nation could be the winning team. Haha. But Ronald Reagan's hasty heart caused him to make the Star Wars program his million-dollar baby before any of the technology was verified, and naturally, accidents will happen. Oh, and by the way, SCP Explained would like to formally apologize for the amount of Ronald Reagan movie puns that were used in the previous section. Based on our understanding of the typical demographics of YouTube viewers, we're pretty sure that you never grew up on the classic films of Ronald Reagan. To most of you, he's probably just the wacky old president from the 80s, so if any of these references flew over your head, we understand. And speaking of flying over our heads, SCP-1514 was developed as an orbital satellite-based defense system that would rely on radio transmissions to direct the behavior of the spacecrafts. Though there were many failures during the Star Wars program's years of operation, It could almost be said that the speculative technologies that created SCP-1514 succeeded a bit too well. During the time it was active, the public details of the Strategic Defense Initiative showed an overly complex deterrent system that risked further escalation in an aggressive global arms race. Reagan's advocacy for it was met with harsh criticism, even prompting one senator to call Star Wars, quote, a fundamental assault on the concepts, alliances, and arms control agreements that have buttressed American security for several decades. And that senator's name was Joe Biden. Yes, that Joe Biden. In 1993, the Star Wars program was dissolved into the Missile Defense Agency, and the United States moved increasingly away from science fiction-inspired laser weaponry. SCP-1514 is an orphaned piece of technology from the Star Wars program, and also one that now falls under the jurisdiction of the SCP Foundation. During the brief window towards the tail of the 20th century that SCP-1514 was operational, it was referred to internally by the codename XYE, Xi. There were a series of bizarre malfunctions that resulted in its decommissioning, and the FBI became directly involved in the transfer of the unit to the Foundation's custody. Even since its discovery in a secure bunker that has since been abandoned by the United States government, SCP-1514's ground console, SCP-1514-1A, has been closely monitored for any signs of irregularity in its condition. SCP-1514-1A is a vaguely coffin-shaped steel device that is capable of sending extraterrestrial radio transmissions. It is outfitted with highly advanced life support systems that are meant to prolong the life of SCP-1514-1B, a seemingly organic life form that resides within the metallic confines of SCP-1514-1A. The health and status of SCP-1514-1B is conveyed to all observers through external displays, such as heart rate monitors and blood pressure valves. The entity itself is obscured by the opaque exterior of the container, and Foundation personnel are advised against any attempts to glimpse its true visage. Any action that could negatively impact the stable condition of SCP-1514-1B is met with immediate termination, and this includes trying to dislodge or modify any of the components of SCP-1514-1A. This is because normal function of SCP-1514-1B's homeostatic status is essential in order to avoid an XK-class scenario. Every hour on the hour, a radio transmission is sent from SCP-1514-1B to the nearest instance of SCP-1514-2, a series of defense satellites of which a currently undisclosable number exists. The anomalous properties of these radio transmissions allow them to bypass all forms of radiation stoppage, including Faraday cages. This is quite fortunate, as a prolonged break from these communications that go on for longer than 36 hours triggers the Xi defense system's so-called coronet contingency, a simultaneous deployment of laser weapons on countless preset targets around the globe. The SCP Foundation has found that at some point when SCP-1514 was outside the control of the United States government, the amount of targets as well as the destructive capability of the X-ray lasers was heavily expanded by further engineering. Though the identity of the parties responsible for the expansion of the Xi defense system is classified to everyone but Level 2 personnel and higher, the anomalous nature of the project has become apparent to all involved. As previously established, SCP-1514-1B is a living entity with a standard deviation of biological processes that maintain its life. Whether it is also the power source of SCP-1514-1A is unknown, but the energy provided seems to come from the unusual components within. A dark red fluid similar in color to hemoglobin has been noted as a major part of the life support functions within the device. The inner mechanisms of SCP-1514 are cybernetic and possesses autonomous agency, and this extends to the physical nature of all accessible SCP-1514-2 instances. Analysis of multiple SCP-1514-2 specimens has revealed that much of what appears to be expected pieces of any modern satellite, including the solar paneling, are actually decoys intended to camouflage the SCP-1514-2 instances as non-anomalous technology. The actual makeup of an SCP-1514-2 instance includes an internal power source of likewise anomalous and possibly biological origin. All attempts made by the SCP Foundation to deactivate the Coronet contingency have been unsuccessful, as SCP-1514 seems unable to respond to any input from a source outside of itself. This is where Calamity threatens to rear its ugly head. It has been several years since malfunctions have caused the Xi defense system to be taken out of commission, and now its internal components are at risk of contamination and failure. 35 hours. SCP-1514-1A fails to send its transmission to SCP-1514-2 for the first time since falling into Foundation custody. This is discovered by maintenance personnel and reported to the rest of the research team. Procedure 83 Onager begins. 34 hours. All Level 2 personnel who are assigned to SCP-1514 double-check the vital signs reported on the life support displays of SCP-1514-1A. Though the interface of the device is beyond comparison to most non-anomalous technology, it is determined that there are no malfunctions with the life support system itself. Additionally, the data being reported is accurate. SCP-1514-1B is suffering from a lapse in surface consciousness, effectively placing it in a coma. 33 hours. A request to investigate the internal components of SCP-1514-1A and possibly SCP-1514-1B is put forth to the higher-ups in the Foundation. Under normal circumstances, this would be a grievous violation of policy regarding SCP-1514, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The request remains pending as Procedure 83 Onager proceeds as planned. 32 hours. SCP-1514-1B remains completely unresponsive. It is still alive, but seemingly growing weaker by the hour. A thorough scan of security footage reveals that a glitch in the system occurred roughly an hour before the discovery of SCP-1514-1B's sudden condition. Researchers believe that an outside radiation signal of some sort was forcibly introduced to the environment of SCP-1514-1A's containment unit. 31 hours. The source of the radiation was confirmed to be a targeted microwave attack from the Global Occult Coalition, whose agents had infiltrated the bunker and falsified their credentials. Though this group of interest is known for taking a hardline stance towards terminating any anomaly they come across, the attempt on SCP-1514-1B's was wholly unexpected. 30 hours. All agents of the GOC still present within the bunker that houses SCP-1514-1A have been dealt with. Care was taken so that the security force did not cause any further damage to the structure during the skirmish. 3 different mobile task forces have been contacted in order to track down any remaining infiltrators. 28 hours. A specialized medical team who deal in treating anomalous former humans arrives at SCP-1514-1A's containment unit. The engineers are ready and willing to help them, but approval on the request to disassemble parts of SCP-1514-1A's external mechanisms is still pending. One crucial factor that prohibits tampering with SCP-1514 is the batractotoxin collars that are issued to all personnel, which activate remotely if any individual violates protocol. At the moment, these collars are still active. To act too hastily and without the approval of the higher-ups could result in the death of Foundation personnel. 25 hours. SCP-1514-1B's condition appears to be stable, though it has still been unable or maybe unwilling to send any transmission to any of the SCP-1514-2 instances. Approval for removing the outer components is still pending, though the timetable has been drastically reduced. After the close call with GOC forces and the pressure of waiting, several members of the research team are allowed to acquire sleep. Others remain awake, contacting key figures within the intelligence agencies of the United States government who might be able to aid in locating SCP-1514-2 instances. 18 hours. Both the medical team and the engineers received the direct approval of the O5 Council to provide internal care for SCP-1514-1B. An access point to the inside of SCP-1514-1A is carefully opened, with caution taken to avoid severing any of the liquid tubes that are part of the life support system. Telekinetic contact with SCP-1514-1B is attempted, but to no avail. 17 hours. Procedure 83 Onager is now fully underway. A series of robotic probes are launched from several sites across the Earth towards the approximate orbit of all known SCP-1514-2 instances. In the absence of any communication from SCP-1514-1B, The probes will have to perform the difficult task of dismantling the laser systems aboard each of the satellites. While in the past, space shuttles containing Foundation personnel have attempted the same thing, there are aspects of SCP-1514-2 that make human intervention impossible. Namely, the empathetic field generated by each instance of SCP-1514-2 that causes most human beings who enter the interior to be sympathetic with SCP-1514-2, and have all other thoughts superseded by the instance's emotions. 16 hours. The Foundation probes are able to match speed with the SCP-1514-2 instances and intercept the path of their orbit. They have begun their automated procedures on dismantling the laser systems. Several of the SCP-1514-2 instances become aware of the tampering and use internal propulsion to escape the grasp of the probes. While the procedure continues on some of the satellites, multiple probes are now off target. 15 hours. With a non-zero number of SCP-1514-2 unable to be located, and several of the probes unable to dismantle the laser systems, Procedure 83 Onager has been abandoned. 14 hours. Documents from the Star Wars program are declassified for the benefit of curing SCP-1514-1B of its comatose condition. Details of an anomalous technology referred to as empathetic resonance are reviewed. The specialized medical personnel, who had never been briefed on SCP-1514 until the previous 24 hours, react accordingly. 12 hours. The health of SCP-1514-1B has improved thanks to the medical intervention, though no transmission has been made. The outer layer of SCP-1514-1A is restored to its previous condition. Monitoring of the vital displays is placed at top priority. 10 hours. Across the SCP Foundation's many sites, backup plans in the case of the Coronet contingency are put into effect. All stops are being pulled out to prevent an XK-class scenario, but most of the researchers know that hope still rides on SCP-1514-1B. 8 hours. Less than a day before the world's destruction by lasers was assured, SCP-1514-1B issued a transmission, which was received by SCP-1514-2. Relief is palpable across the whole of the SCP Foundation, but it will take another hour before everything is officially out of the woods. 7 hours. SCP-1514-1B has transmitted another signal in keeping with its usual schedule. SCP-1514-2 instances continue to receive the communication and have not shown any signs of enacting the Coronet contingency. The life support system shows that its homeostatic condition is now well within standard deviation. 6 hours. All aspects of SCP-1514 are nominal. The XK-class scenario has been averted. 3 hours later, the Foundation throws a formal pizza party for the entire staff on the site housing SCP-1514 to celebrate the momentous occasion of the planet being saved. And so the Star Wars were won. But within this victory was the unspoken acknowledgement of the unlikely humanity of SCP-1514-1B. While those that had developed its components had not provided the entity with any capacity to do anything but relay messages, the entity was now proven to be capable of fighting for its life and coming back from the brink of demise. Its thoughts and feelings are able to be conveyed across vast distances to other related entities within each instance of SCP-1514-2. And what defines humanity more than our ability to communicate? Tires screamed against the asphalt, filling the air with the smells of burning fire. Searing heat roared outside the car as a pursuit vehicle with a mounted flamethrower spat long streaks of superheated kerosene, the fiery orange tendrils singeing the already worn paintwork. On the opposite side, a motorcycle zipped next to the car, with 2 occupants riding, one driving, the other about to aim a spear right at the driver's seat. Pete slammed on the brakes only for a second, allowing the fire-blasting truck to pass by his car, instead spewing flames over the 2 marauders on the bike. They screamed as the rider swerved the motorcycle, and both he and the Lancer on the back came tumbling off, rolling around on fire. Before they had even hit the ground, Pete had switched gears and stomped his foot back down on the accelerator, the modified engine of his car whooshing as it came to life in seconds, then sped around the other side of the pursuing truck. The marauder operating the flamethrower was still struggling to swivel the weapon around to aim it at the car again, when Pete wrenched the sawed-off shotgun from the holster strapped loosely around his leg. He knew there was only a single shell left in one of the barrels. He'd barely managed to scrounge up any recently, but desperate times called for it. Pointing the gun out of the driver's side window, he squeezed the trigger. The blast burst from the shotgun, striking its target. Boom. The kerosene tank fueling the flamethrower erupted, engulfing the pursuing truck in an enormous fireball, killing the marauders on board. But Pete's eyes were already on the road, still speeding away. He caught a glimpse behind in the rear view, the glinting of glass and metal in the sunlight as a horde of vehicles gave chase. The beating of war drums and roar of engines were still a few miles behind them, but carried across the open desert like a foreboding warning. From her hiding place under the blanket in the passenger seat, SCP-053 poked her head out. "Are we there yet?" Pete sighed. He hated days like these. He couldn't remember how long it had been since the world had collapsed. It had to have been years by now at least. But then again, who could tell anymore? Nobody was keeping time. They were too focused on surviving day to day. Pete had been a delivery man back in the old days. The before, as people had taken to calling it. Even after an all-out nuclear war, he was still stuck in the same old line of work. Typical. He knew he wasn't the only one still alive who remembered what had happened. But as the days went on, there seemed to be fewer and fewer who didn't. Gangs of marauders and scavengers had coalesced into factions, merging together under names that resembled groups from the before. Each held a reverence for the make-believe idea of what their predecessors were, but few actually had the knowledge of the scraps they were fighting over. The ones who called themselves children of the Chaos Insurgency now controlled all of Philadelphia, which meant that area was out of bounds for anyone passing through. The children were ruthless, and they had salvaged military hardware to keep any would-be invaders out of their territory. Occasionally, as the battered car that now served as his home careened down the ruined highways, Pete passed patrols of brokens, sifting through the scrapped husks of vehicles, looking for any worthwhile components. He normally kept his distance. Another time when he'd had to trade with one of their chapters, they made him sit and learn for hours about their god, Mechane, and something about their holy mission to rebuild the world. Looking outside, it clearly wasn't going all that well. When the world had learned about the secretive SCP Foundation, that anomalous beings, entities, objects, places, and people existed, mass hysteria had swept the entire globe. Pete often thought about those days, whenever he drove past any of the old, worn-out billboards with the faded words, "Could someone you know be an anomaly? Contact the SCP Foundation today," still just about legible. Everyone had been rightly terrified that the Foundation had the capability to destroy the world. Some of the anomalies that they kept caged certainly had the potential to. But when that first atomic flash burst across the skyline, it became clear that someone else had managed to beat them to it. Pete had always assumed that some other power had launched the first nuke and bombed the world back to the Stone Age. He'd heard mutterings, though, mostly from those who were already on their way out, dying from radiation poisoning, that the Foundation had been responsible somehow. There was a rumor about some old Soviet-era anomaly the Foundation had under wraps, some kind of reanimated corpse that could initiate a nuclear launch. Dead Hand, the stories called it. Pete had been completing a job ferrying fuel and water to a settlement of survivors. That was the most part of his post-apocalyptic vocation, making dangerous deliveries for a small share of supplies to keep himself alive. No one paid in money anymore, just bartered for whatever was still edible and drinkable, anything without too much radiation in it. On a few rare occasions, Pete would get something that seemed a little more exciting, but it usually amounted to smuggling ice cream to some elitist, shut-off wasteland community, or delivering an old poker chip to a billionaire who stayed safe from the radiation in their expensive homes built to outlast the end of the world. But this new job was one of the even rarer kind, moving an anomaly. Since the war, the Foundation had fallen into ruin. Most of their facilities had either been destroyed or blasted open when the bombs dropped, leading to all manner of nightmares spilling out to wreak havoc. Nobody dared set foot in Alaska now that the flesh that hates had spread there, leaving no survivors. The few sites that had survived the nukes and continued functioning had soon been broken into by marauders and scavengers, hoping either for some quick revenge against the Foundation or some impressive salvage they could trade for clean water. What they found waiting for them in those Foundation sites was almost always more than they'd bargained for. Tapping the underside of an old dog food can, eating the dregs of his only meal in weeks, Pete turned around, gun raised, startled. Someone was nearby. It had been hours since he'd left the settlement, delivered their water as commissioned, and then set off in search of any other leads. He'd never expected one of them to come looking for him. Obscured by the shadows inside the dilapidated building Pete had been scavenging, a figure stepped calmly towards him. Their clothes seemed almost too neat, too well-maintained when compared to the rest of the survivors the post-apocalyptic postman had encountered. From repurposed body armor to leather chaps and hockey masks, Pete had seen it all. The figure wore a cleanly pressed suit, their face hidden from view. In fact, it was like Pete couldn't properly focus his eyes clearly on them. "You must be Peter." They spoke calmly, despite the shotgun trained at them, almost as if they knew it was empty. "Pete," his reply was blunt, the expression on his face not quite mad but more perturbed. "And who the hell are you?" "Me?" The figure chuckled dryly. "I'm nobody, just someone with a job for you." Hearing their offer out, it sounded relatively simple. Transport an anomaly of great importance from a marauder encampment to an old Foundation site. No questions asked. The exact kind of legitimate and above-board business Pete was used to running. In exchange, there was more than water and fuel for his car on the line. The mysterious stranger said they could offer a way out. Pete had heard rumors that back during the Before, the Foundation had knowledge of other universes, even a few ways to access them. And there was bound to be one out there where the bombs never dropped, the war never happened. But like most jobs, this one wasn't without a catch. Or two. The first was that Pete had to retrieve the anomaly, with only their old Foundation designation as their only lead, SCP-053. He had no idea what it looked like, just that they were holed up at a marauder encampment a short drive away. The other catch was the site Pete was meant to take the anomaly to. Nobody knew where to find it. It had been one of the Foundation's most secretive facilities, so tracking it would be tricky. Luckily, Pete knew of someone who might be able to help. But first, he needed to find SCP-053. Arriving at the encampment, he was immediately put on edge by just how angry everyone seemed. The Marauders weren't normally a civilized bunch, but at least typically only attacked anyone they thought was worth robbing for supplies. At this camp, though, they were starting fights with each other, brawling so much that they barely paid Pete any mind. He snuck a discarded shotgun shell into his pocket, his battered remnants of a leather jacket the only thing keeping him safe from a stray punch or the slash of a homemade shiv. He passed a makeshift gladiatorial arena, where marauders were fighting each other, rusted road signs and other scrap metal fastened to their bodies to act as armor, or wielded as weapons and shields. Others were screaming for bloodshed from the sidelines, rattling at the fence while two marauders entered the ring, each intending to be the one who walked back out alive. Amidst all the angry chaos, however, it was easy to spot SCP-053. She was the only person around not trying to kill anyone. Although he hadn't expected the anomaly he was sent to collect to be a child, Pete understood more once she explained what exactly she could do. Whenever someone looked at her, or even spent so much as a few moments in her company, it triggered a violent homicidal rage that made them try to kill anyone around them. Pete felt no different than usual around her. Perhaps the fallout from the war or the gradual exposure to radiation had inoculated him against this particular anomaly. It could have been that SCP-053's abilities had been overextended by sending all of the marauders around her into a murderous frenzy. Or maybe Pete had just changed too much since the nukes had dropped. He had certainly never had to kill anyone over a canteen of water back during the Before. In fact, he was hard-pressed to remember a time when he wasn't feeling... angry wasn't the right word. More a passive background feeling of annoyance, perturbed. Next came tracking down the Foundation site, and fortunately, Pete knew exactly who to ask. As they drove off with SCP-053 in tow, he noticed a commotion in the Marauder encampment as it receded into the distance. They'd stopped attacking each other and noticed the child was gone. Following a route of mostly dirt tracks, Pete kept the car at a steady speed until he saw what he was looking for, a makeshift green cross, the now universally accepted sign of a wasteland doctor. This shack was neutral ground, a place where anyone could seek medical assistance as long as they didn't start trouble. Those who did found themselves being surgically turned into zombies by the literal beak-faced doctor who ran the place. SCP-049 had spent a long time living in Foundation containment, and Pete knew it. If anyone could point them in the direction of the site they were looking for, it was the Plague Doctor. The surgeon was bemused by Pete's request. That particular site had been the Foundation's most infamous before the bombs fell, and one of the hardest to find. According to Pete's anonymous client, there were a few potential locations, each one as far away and hard to reach as the others. It was either in Michigan, 35 kilometers northwest of Lansing, on the side of an old United States Air Force base in Omaha, Nebraska, or vaguest of all, somewhere in Tennessee. The Plague Doctor seemed evasive, asking to at least know the reason why Pete was searching for the site in question. The post-apocalyptic postman pointed towards SCP-053, sitting quietly in the back seat of his car.
Ah, of course,
SCP-049 mused.
Perhaps it is time.
With that, the anomalous doctor directed Pete towards the old airbase in Nebraska. A few miles along the journey, and the rev of engines had started gaining on them. Pete had no idea why the Marauders were coming after SCP-053, but the closer their jury-rigged vehicles got to his car, the more of them became enraged thanks to the anomalous girl's abilities. Except this time, their murderous rage was fixated on killing Pete. As the smoke billowed from the fiery wreck of the flamethrower truck, Pete saw what was up ahead. He slammed on the accelerator, ramming the car through the wire fence gate that surrounded what had once been Site 19. Aware that the Marauders were still on their trail, Pete pulled the car over and urged SCP-053 to get out. The nameless client had said she would know what to do once she arrived at Site 19, and after thanking Pete for bringing her there, the anomalous girl wandered off. Once she had left, Pete searched around the mess in the front of his car for another shotgun shell. He was out. Still, he thought to himself, this would make for a hell of a delivery. He marched out to face down the approaching Marauder vehicles, shotgun aimed outwards at them, one man against an army. But to his surprise, they slowed down, hulking homemade monster trucks parking gently in front of him. Expecting a fight, he kept his empty gun raised as a panicked group of Marauders exited their vehicles and rushed over to him.
"We were trying to get you to stop,"
one of them said frantically.
"Why did you have to bring her here?"
Pointing the gun at the Marauder, Pete demanded an explanation. The distraught survivor told him that although SCP-053 put everyone around her in a state of homicidal rage, it had at least kept her away from Site 19. This group weren't Marauders. They explained that they were the descendants of a group called the Mana Charitable Foundation, a group that had wanted to preserve and improve the world using anomalies back during the before. They had taken the anomalous child in willingly, knowing that her powers would make them all attack each other, but that was preferable to the apocalypse.
She is death,
their leader said solemnly.
Horseman of the apocalypse, you just brought her to her steed.
A reptilian roar emanated from somewhere in the facility, followed by a crashing, as something unkillable burst out of Site 19, carrying SCP-053 on its back. Pete looked on with the same look strewn across his tired face. He was perturbed. Now go check out I Survived 100 Days of SCP-001 Daybreaks, Here's What Happened, and SCP-XK Class End of the World Scenarios Explained for more.